In the Planescape campaign setting for D&D, there are 17 outer planes, which are essentially the realms of D&D's afterlife. There's one for each moral alignment, ranging from lawful evil to chaotic good and everything in between. I've already covered the planes of lawful evil, lawful good, chaotic evil, neutral lawful good, lawful neutral, chaotic good, and chaotic neutral in depth, as well as Sigil, the city that sits at the center of the outer planes. In this video, I'll be covering the plane of chaotic neutral evil, the windswept depths of Pandemonium. I'll be using sources from all editions of D&D, but as usual, most of it comes from the Planescape books of 2nd edition. If you're wondering why I'm covering Pandemonium now, it's because my supporters over on Patreon voted for it. If you're a fan of what I do and would like to support me, you can join my Patreon and gain the ability to vote on my videos as well. You also get access to update posts, ad-free videos, audio-only versions of videos weeks before the final version is published, and you get your name at the end of my videos. And a new perk I've recently added is access to my scripts, in case you'd like a written version of all of this. So thank you to all of my Patreon supporters for helping to make videos like these possible. But anyway, on with the guide to Pandemonium. I always like to start these videos by looking at the morality, or perhaps more accurately, the alignment of the plane. I think it helps to get a good idea of the character of the plane and its inhabitants. Of course, sometimes there's a discrepancy between the supposed alignment of a plane and what it actually turns out to be like, and that's always interesting too. Pandemonium is the plane of chaotic neutral evil. So what that means is that it's chaotic neutral tinged with evil. Strongly chaotic, weakly evil. Most of the planes I've covered so far have had a more straightforward alignment, as I've mostly covered the major axes of the Great Wheel. But for planes on the minor axes, since the D&D sources don't go into that fine of detail when describing alignments, I think it makes sense to look at the alignments on either side and then combine them. So let's see what the various editions of D&D have to say about chaotic neutrality and chaotic evil, and from that, form an idea of what chaotic neutral evil should look like. In 1st edition D&D, chaotic evil is all about freedom, randomness, and woe. Life has no value to chaotic evil characters. They look down on things like law and order or kindness, and seek to bring themselves power in a system ruled by individual whims. Chaotic neutral characters value randomness and disorder above any respect for life and goodness, or evil and disrespect for life. They see good and evil as forces to be balanced, lest chaos suffer. In 2nd edition, chaotic evil characters are motivated by the desire for personal gain and pleasure, and see nothing wrong with taking whatever they want by whatever means possible. They see laws and governments as tools for weaklings who are unable to fend for themselves. When they band together, it's typically due to a strong leader bullying their underlings into obedience, and that leader is likely to be replaced at the first sign of weakness. Chaotic neutral characters believe that there is no order to anything, including their own actions. They follow whatever whim strikes them at the moment, with good and evil being irrelevant when making decisions. In 3rd edition, chaotic evil characters are driven by greed, hatred, and lust for destruction. They're hot-tempered, vicious, arbitrarily violent, and unpredictable. Chaotic evil people can only be made to work together by force, and their leader lasts only as long as they can thwart attempts to overthrow them. Chaotic neutral characters are individualists first and last. They follow their whims and value their own liberty without striving to protect the freedom of others. They avoid authority and challenge traditions. They're unpredictable, but not random. In 4th edition, chaotic evil characters have a complete disregard for others, believing they're the only beings that matter. They'll kill, steal, betray, or whatever they need to do to get what they want. Their word is meaningless and their actions are destructive. Chaotic neutral doesn't exist in 4th edition. If you're chaotic, you're evil. In 5th edition, chaotic evil characters act with arbitrary violence, spurred by their greed, hatred, or bloodlust. Chaotic neutral characters follow their whims, holding their personal freedom above all else. As ever, I don't really think 5th edition is even worth considering here, as its definitions are always just the same thing that 3rd edition said, except pared down to the point of near uselessness. So, as you can see, alignment changes depending on what edition of D&D we're talking about. Chaos in earlier editions is more about randomness, and in later editions is more about individualism. Evil in earlier editions is more about obtaining power with no regard for others, and in later editions it's more about causing harm for the sheer pleasure of it. But overall, I would say that what it means to be chaotic neutral evil is that you value your freedom above all else, and you act on your whims, and your whims, more often than not, happen to be destructive or harmful to others. You might find it enjoyable to cause suffering, but that's secondary, and the harm you cause is primarily through using other people as expendable tools to pursue your own individual goals, whereas a chaotic evil individual would be much more inclined to cause suffering for its own sake, and a chaotic neutral individual would not derive any satisfaction from causing suffering, and their whims are, on average, not harmful. As I discussed in my Mechanus and Limbo videos, I think neutrality, at least as described, is actually a bit evil. The whole not caring about good or evil thing has a tendency to allow evil to happen. I have had some people point out to me that the same thing should be true of goodness, too. The idea is that if you stay out of the way, yes, you leave room for evil, but also for good. But while in theory that's true, I don't think it works out that way in practice, because I think the default conditions of the world skew toward evil. Evil is easier to achieve. Goodness takes more effort to make happen. It's easier to destroy than it is to build. The world, without your intervention, is a pretty fucked up place. Without anybody's intervention, I would argue. For example, predation as a mechanism of survival, while natural, seems completely fucked to me. The natural order skews heavily toward misery and violence, but more about that when I do a video on the Beastlands. So what I'm saying though is that I think doing nothing when the status quo is evil is also evil, at least a little bit. So I think of it like this. Neutral characters might intervene to prevent evil from being done when they see it around them. Good characters would do even more by seeking evil out to prevent it, or doing kind acts for the people around them. And evil characters would let evil happen or help it to happen. And if they do ever intervene in a way that seems to be preventing evil, such as saving someone, it's because they have something to gain from it personally. Because of course, most evil people don't care about maintaining the net evil in the world, but rather are just selfish. So if they do ever save someone's life, it's not out of the goodness of their heart, but because they've got an angle. As several people pointed out from the drowning child scenario that I discussed in my Limbo video, an evil person might also save the child. And I agree. Of course, there are those types of evil people that just delight in causing harm and death, but even they might save someone every once in a while. It just depends on how much pleasure they'll get out of the harm caused versus how much power they can expect to gain by helping. Which I do think is a somewhat interesting thought, because it indicates that it would be possible to create a good society full of evil people. If you align the incentives just right, you could set up a system such that even people who are solely motivated by personal gain are convinced into being helpful and pro-social members of society, simply because acting that way has been made convenient and rewarding. And you might not even need good people to set up or maintain the system, because the incentives of the people making the rules might be different than the incentives of the people following them. In fact, they're definitely different. For instance, a ruler might outlaw murder, not because he cares at all about the lives of the individuals that he rules over, but because if his subjects are killing each other, that makes them less productive, and therefore less useful to him. It's hard to extract labor from a corpse, after all. Obviously, outlawing murder alone doesn't make a society good, but you can see the idea. It's possible that a society that's maximally productive, and thus maximally lucrative for the ruling class, might be one that's maximally harmonious, where people are free of disease and strife and live long, happy lives. Everyone involved could be of evil character, but the rulers see the benefits of a harmonious society, and to everyone else, the potential reward of disobeying isn't worth the cost of getting caught. So, in other words, with the right system in place, everyone can be maximally selfish, and yet the end result is indistinguishable from maximal selflessness. Because, as they say, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Or I guess more aptly, what's good for the gander is good for the goose. Of course, that was just a digression I found interesting, and isn't what's happening in Pandemonium. That would take far more cooperation and lawfulness than the people of Pandemonium can manage. They are chaotic, after all. And if the way I see it, chaotic neutral is already biased towards evil, then it fits right in for the plane of chaotic neutral evil. Though, of course, there is always a spectrum within any given plane. I don't think it would be realistic to imagine that every single creature inhabiting a plane behaves the same sort of way. So I think this selfish individualism works well for most of the people of Pandemonium, but then, of course, there's also the people who take a bit more of an active approach when it comes to causing harm and spreading misery. But honestly, I don't think most of the people of Pandemonium are actually ill-intentioned. Mistrustful and insular, yes, but not cruel. It's more so the monsters and the plane itself that's cruel. Pandemonium is the plane of madness, nicknamed the Howling Plane. It's a bleak plane of solid rock filled with tunnels and caverns, so there is no sky. But there is wind. The most prominent feature of the plane is the incessant, incredibly loud, strong, cold wind that churns and whines through the endless tunnels. Some describe this plane as the opposite of Isgard, as that plane is an endless sky filled with huge rivers of earth, and Pandemonium is a plane of endless earth riddled with caverns filled with screeching wind. Pandemonium is lonely, desolate, dark, maddening, isolating, loud, wet, and generally unpleasant. The original meaning of the word pandemonium, or pandemonium, comes from John Milton's Paradise Lost from 1667, where Pandemonium is the capital of hell. Pan meaning all, and daemonium, a declension of daemon, meaning evil spirit or lesser spirit. So essentially, the place of all demons. But in modern usage, the word means a wild and noisy uproar or commotion, which is more fitting for this plane. But in another sense, it hardly fits the plane at all, because Pandemonium is actually the least populated plane, which should tell you a thing or two about how unpleasant this place is. So there's plenty of uproar and commotion in terms of noise. In fact, from just listening, you would think that every screaming madman in existence lives here, but there's hardly any uproar and commotion in terms of actual activity, because the plane is nearly empty. Most of the people who do live here are those who have been exiled, marooned, or banished. Nearly all of the outer planes have layers, which are like subplanes, different variations on the central theme of the plane. Each layer is a separate, infinite space from the other layers, though they are magically connected to each other through layer barriers, portals, or conduits. The magical wind that permeates the plane can pass through the barriers between layers with ease. So if you happen upon a dead-end passage with a strong wind seemingly blowing right through the rock wall, it's probably actually a magical barrier to another layer. I'll talk much more about all of the layers of Pandemonium later in the video, but as an overview, Pandemonium has 4. The first is Pandesmos. It's the most habitable layer where the caverns are largest. Of the few inhabitants that Pandemonium has, most reside in this layer. The second layer is Cocytus. The tunnels are smaller here, and the wind that whistles through them sounds like cries of sorrow, so it's called the layer of lamentation. The third layer is Phlegethon. It's a wet place full of stalagmites and stalactites, named the layer of darkness because the walls swallow all light and reflect nothing. The fourth layer is Agathion. This layer is extremely dangerous, mysterious, and largely inaccessible. It has no tunnels, and instead is just solid rock dotted here and there with great spherical bubbles, unconnected to each other. Travelers to Pandemonium, or more likely, people that come here involuntarily, have 3 main, severe issues to deal with. The first and most immediate is deafness. The stale winds that blow through the plane's twisting caverns never stop, and in most places are deafening. Though in some passages, the winds are merely just loud, and in a few sheltered areas, the chilly winds howling through the tunnels sound like distant wails of torment. Disturbing, but relatively quiet. But on the other end of things, in some places the sound is not only deafening, but so loud as to actually cause considerable physical pain. In game terms, that means taking sonic or thunder damage. So the locals have learned the quietest routes around the plane and stick to those. But for newcomers who haven't learned the lay of the land, it's much more of a problem. The ambient noise is enough that it becomes very hard to communicate, as you have to shout at the top of your lungs just to talk to someone who's 10 feet away, and even then, they might not hear you. Every word, scream, or shout is caught by the wind and flung through all the layers of the plane. So many of those screams you hear really are screams, and not just the sound of the wind. But in most places throughout the plane, the noise is enough to actually cause permanent deafness if you fail a saving throw. At least until you have someone cast something like Dispel Magic on you. So it's either sustain intense hearing damage or wear earplugs. And of course, wearing earplugs in such a noisy plane amounts to being deaf anyway. But at least it's not permanent. But continued exposure to the cacophonous wailing of the winds of Pandemonium has a tendency, actually a certainty, to cause madness. Everyone who remains in this plane for long enough eventually goes insane, at least a little. And for most people, it doesn't take long. And the longer you're here, the more insane you'll be. Have you ever tried to go to sleep, but there was a sound? Not a consistent white noise type sound that fades into the background or even helps you sleep. No, I'm talking about an interrupting, irritating sound, where whenever you're close to maybe falling asleep, the sound shakes you back into an uncomfortable and angry consciousness. If you've ever dealt with that, you know that just 30 minutes of it can be maddening, let alone an entire night. I imagine that to be something like what the winds of Pandemonium are like. The wails and howls and screeches of the wind are grating, irritating, piercing, and constant, but not in such a way that you could ever forget about them. Instead, they're always at the forefront of your mind, except perhaps through the expenditure of great mental effort. The madness of Pandemonium progresses in 4 stages. First, frustration, then despair, then hysteria, then resignation. Mechanically, when players are in Pandemonium, the DM periodically calls for saving throws. A failure moves you one step further along the path of wind madness. Typically, these saving throws would be made once per adventuring day, but more would certainly be called for in particularly noisy regions, and time spent inside sheltered areas wouldn't require a saving throw at all, as the sound of the wind is still present but bearable. Those who fail that first saving throw and enter the frustration stage become snappish, irritable, and impatient to get the hell out of this plane so they can get a break from this horrible, ceaseless noise. They don't want to plan or talk things out, they just want to act. So mechanically, this entails a -1 to both wisdom and intelligence. Those in the second stage, despair, start to feel completely hopeless. This noise is never going to stop, is it? What's the use fighting it? People in this stage don't do things on their own initiative, and I mean initiative in the regular sense of the word, not the D&D combat meaning. For instance, if they're in a group that's making a plan, the despairer will just sit there glumly without getting involved in the discussion. They'll agree to the plan, but without any real enthusiasm or conviction. But when it comes to combat, they'll fight with an incredible sense of desperation. While they might appear hopeless most of the time, it's a denial of an inner turmoil. There is still fight left within them. They just need a strong push, like a fight for their life, for that to come to the surface. Mechanically, despairing characters are automatically surprised in combat, meaning they miss the first round, but they get a +1 to attack and damage rolls. Those in the third stage, hysteria, become absolutely desperate to get out of this freaking place. As soon as they fail their third saving throw, they begin running around and screaming, threatening anyone who gets in their way, pleading for mercy, and so on, until they collapse to the ground exhausted, muttering to themselves with their hands pressed over their ears and their eyes tightly closed. Some might start weeping uncontrollably. Some might snarl and act like animals. Some might curse non-stop for several hours. It just depends on the personality. After a little while, they can be drawn out of their hysterical states enough to be led along from place to place, but still with their eyes shut and ears clamped, which means they're unable to fight or really do anything useful. If they're taken to shelter, they'll recover a bit and act as if they're in stage 2 again. But as soon as they leave the sheltered area, the hysteria will set back in, making them extremely reluctant to leave the shelter. Since this is the stage that renders a character most helpless, as a DM it's advisable to make this the shortest stage. Those in the fourth and final stage, resignation, have come to terms with the winds howling, at least partially. They've accepted that the noise is inescapable, and have learned to ignore the anguish it brings. Kind of. It can't truly be ignored or overcome, so what the people in this stage have learned how to do is cope with it, to convert the torment of the winds into something else, manifesting as some other defect, unique to the individual. A phobia, a nervous tic, a mania, some sort of mental disorder. Perhaps you develop OCD and feel a compulsion to go through your entire inventory and make sure that everything is there 12 times a day. Perhaps you glance nervously over your shoulder once every couple seconds, even when you're supposedly relaxed. Perhaps you start having hallucinations, or you become a kleptomaniac, or you're frequently struck with uncontrollable laughter, or you frequently forget who you are, or you develop multiple personalities, or you become extremely paranoid, or you become completely unable to remain still, or you start having seizures, or you develop Tourette's syndrome, or you become a compulsive liar, and so on. Whatever defects a player might pick up, for NPCs, it's worse, as these madness-induced idiosyncrasies get more severe the longer you're on the plane. That might mean that the one you have gets worse, or you develop multiple of them. Essentially, all inhabitants of the plane have long ago progressed to the 4th stage of madness. Of course, there's a broad spectrum of insanity. Some people are so insane as to be wild and unintelligible, and others are only slightly crazy, or express their insanity much more subtly. But still, everyone in the plane has some sort of madness-induced eccentricity or defect. Whichever stage of madness you reach in Pandemonium, there's no going back in the other direction, except through the use of a wish spell or similarly powerful effect. However, this madness only persists as long as you're in Pandemonium. As soon as you leave, you'll go back to normal. But if you ever return to the plane, your madness will resume right where it left off. And among veteran adventurers in the Outer Planes, these quirks of wind madness are seen as something of a badge of honor, because they're proof of experience and survival. Savvy planers, which are natives of the Outer Planes, know that a person exhibiting symptoms of madness upon entering the plane is a sign that they've been here before. So if you hire a guide, and as soon as you enter the plane, they start violently twitching, you can rest assured that you've got someone with experience. They're the real deal. But if your party enters Pandemonium and no one exhibits any signs of insanity, you're probably in for some real trouble. Of course, to those not in the know, such as people from the prime material plane, also called primes or the clueless, the effect is rather reversed. They might be rather dismayed to find that their guide, who seemed so strong and confident just a moment ago, is now jumping at every shadow and speaking to a voice in his head. The third major issue you'll have to deal with in Pandemonium is blindness. This plane is entirely underground. There is no sky and there are no sources of light. You might expect some glowing mushrooms or bioluminescent creatures, but nope, Pandemonium has no natural sources of light whatsoever. You might be thinking, that's fine. 6 of the 9 races in the 2014 Player's Handbook, and 7 of the 10 races in the 2024 Player's Handbook have dark vision. Not a problem. And while I do think that the abundance of races with dark vision in D&D is an issue, that issue is really exacerbated by how, in my experience, many people play dark vision incorrectly. But if you use the correct rules for dark vision, the darkness of the plane is still going to be a problem. Dark vision allows you to see in darkness as if it was dim light, out to 60 feet, unless you're a drow and have superior dark vision, which goes out to 120 feet. But that still means all of your perception checks that rely on sight have disadvantage, at least in 5th edition. It works differently in other editions, and in fact it's even more OP. For instance, in 3rd edition, it works how most people who play 5th edition seem to think it works. You can see in darkness as if it was normal light, just in black and white. Really, 3rd edition low light vision is how 5th edition dark vision works. It's the same between 3rd and 4th edition, but the difference is that 4th edition doesn't give any of the standard playable races dark vision, but 3rd edition gives it to dwarves and half-orcs. In 2nd edition, dark vision is instead called infravision, and there's 2 definitions of it, depending on how much complexity you want in your game. The simple version is that it's just dark vision in the same overpowered sense as 3rd and 4th edition. The complex version is that it allows you to see the infrared spectrum, allowing you to see heat. In some ways that makes it better than the first definition, like if there's enemies hiding behind objects, you'd be able to see the heat coming off of them. But mostly, I think it's worse. I don't know which way most people who play 2nd edition do it, but since the OP Dark Vision version is an official option, actually the default, then we've had this problem of way too many races with OP Dark Vision for quite a long time. 4 of the 6 standard 2nd edition races have infravision, and for reference, 5 of the 7 standard 3rd edition races have low light vision or better, and 5 of the 8 standard 4th edition races have low light vision. So really, 5th edition isn't the worst offender when it comes to the overuse of dark vision. It actually comes nearly in last place, next to 4th edition, in terms of both how many standard races can see in the dark and how effective seeing in the dark is. But even if you're playing by those 2nd edition infravision variant rules, darkness is still a problem in this plane. The cold stone walls of Pandemonium absorb and dissipate heat unnaturally quickly, and the plane's petitioners don't give off any body heat. So essentially, unless you're using the OP Dark Vision of 3rd edition or the simple 2nd edition infravision rules, whether or not you've got dark vision, you'll want to bring a light of your own. But you can't rely on torches or any sort of open flame because the howling winds will just blow it out. So the best bet is to either use some really well-made lanterns or magical light. But then that creates a new problem. In a plane that's totally dark, turning on a light is a great way to draw attention to yourself. It's like lighting a beacon, alerting every creature within a few miles to your presence. You might as well be shouting, "Hey, I'm here, and I'm new, and I don't know what I'm doing. Come and get me." And since the creatures here are skewed toward evil, it's not exactly the greatest idea. You might think that the intense darkness of the plane would be the first thing a newcomer would notice, but it actually takes a back seat to the deafening winds. The intense and unbearable wailing of the wind is more immediately noticeable than the fact that you can't even see. The deafness, madness, and blindness of the plane lead many people to consider Pandemonium the least hospitable plane. There are hotter planes and colder planes, and planes with more terrible inhabitants, but no plane is more mind-numbingly exhausting. And while those are the 3 main problems Pandemonium imposes, they aren't the only things you'll have to deal with when navigating the plane. The wind isn't just incredibly noisy and maddening and extinguishes fires, but in much of the plane it's also cold, sapping the heat from your bones. And it's rather forceful in many places throughout the plane too. In some tunnels, the winds flow faster and colder than others. In some passages, the wind rushes by like a hurricane gale, blowing you off your feet and sending you flying down the tunnel, smacking into the walls like a pinball, battering you to bits. The wind can get strong enough that it carries you for miles before finally dashing you across the rocks into a lifeless pulp. And it's unpredictable too. The walls of the caverns and tunnels hold so many tiny hidden inlets and outlets where the wind can blow in from or to that there's no way to know how the wind will behave. A relatively calm wind could turn fierce and terrible just a few paces ahead. Or a new wind could blow in from behind you, turning the passage into a turbulent wind tunnel. The tunnels of Pandemonium run the whole gamut of possible sizes. Some are tiny crawlways that are barely large enough for an imp to fit through, while others are gargantuan caverns hundreds of miles across. Spaces that are so vast that entire kingdoms can fit within them, where you could even forget that you're underground because the cavern ceiling isn't visible. It's important to remember that the scale and wonder of the outer planes puts the prime material plane to shame. Things are grander, more amazing, and more mind-boggling than you could ever possibly find on any prime world. So the largest caverns of Pandemonium are far larger than the largest caverns in the material plane. And you might expect there to be some relationship between the size of the tunnel and the intensity of the wind, that the winds flow slower in larger passages where there's more space for the air to spread out, and faster in constricted passages. But this, generally, isn't the case. You can find huge spaces where the wind is just a tormented whisper, and other equally large spaces filled with a deadly vortex of bone-chilling air. You just never know. The gravity in Pandemonium is a bit funky as well. You see, there is no consistent down in this plane. Gravity is oriented to whatever natural cavern wall you're closest to, such that the only difference between the floor and a wall is which one you're currently walking on. But you can just as easily approach the wall and walk on that too. But you don't really experience it that way. For one thing, Pandemonium is all caverns and tunnels, and for the most part, natural stone passageways. so there are not many 90-degree angles that clearly delineate the difference between one surface and another, like you'd find in a typical dungeon. A whole lot of the passages are circular, so it could even be hard to keep track of which part of the wall you originally were walking on, unintentionally ending up upside down. And for another thing, rather than a sense of walking from floor to wall, the tunnels seem to somehow roll to keep in pace with you as you walk, so it more so feels like it's just all floor. As convenient as that may sound, it is an evil plane, so there's gotta be a downside, which is that this experience is rather disconcerting and, I imagine, a bit nauseating, at least for people accustomed to normal gravity. But it could certainly make for some cool, if challenging to actually run, combat scenarios, especially in narrow passageways where jumping brings you closer to the ceiling than the floor, allowing a dexterous character to jump into the air, flip halfway, and then land on the ceiling, which to them is now the floor. And from the way that buildings and towns in this plane are described, I don't think these gravitational effects apply to every surface, as fun as that might be. From what I understand, you can't just walk up the wall of a building. I believe it's just the walls of the tunnels and caverns of the plane that behave this way. And since a building would be built onto one wall, it's that same wall that you'd be gravitationally bound to. So being inside artificially constructed spaces would feel normal, at least in large caverns. I could very well imagine a small cavern where a multi-storied building reaches the other side of the cavern, so that if you climb a few flights of stairs, gravity reverses, and the rest of the building is upside down compared to the lower, or rather upper, floors. Though it is a cool idea to imagine that the strange gravity of this plane affects artificial walls too, and the buildings of Pandemonium are designed with every surface as a floor, so that you could be inside a tavern and there'd be tables on the walls and the ceiling too. If you wanted to incorporate that into your vision of Pandemonium, go for it. I just don't think it's officially intended. And I think I should clarify that gravity is oriented to what you might think of as the outermost wall of any given cavern or tunnel. For instance, if there's a cavern with a large plateau in it, you couldn't just walk up the side of the plateau. Gravity would still be oriented to the wall that the plateau itself is jutting out of. So climbing hills and mountains and whatnot would still work the same way as it does anywhere, except for if they reach beyond the midpoint of the cavern you're in which case your sense of gravity would upend itself. Pandemonium is somewhat of a wet plane, at least in the sense that most of the endless caverns and passages of the plane have a stream running through them. In some places, simply a trickle of water, and in others, raging rivers. Since there's no consistent down in the plane, the water flows along some wall or another. And, of course, there's no real reason that a river's course has to stay along the same wall, but can corkscrew from underfoot to overhead and back again. In some cases, the water has been diverted toward the center of the tunnel, where the gravity of all the walls is counterbalanced, causing the river to run in mid-air. Since the water can get caught between the gravity of equidistant walls, I don't see why the same thing couldn't happen to people. I could even imagine that being used as a form of torture. Place someone in the exact center of a large cavern, and since gravity is pulling on them equally from all directions, they'll hang in place, unable to escape if they have no magical means of doing so. I imagine you could find skeletons just floating in midair from the people this has happened to, though with the general darkness, you probably wouldn't be able to see most of them. But 3rd edition specifies that in tunnels where gravity is cancelled out by equal force on all sides, and they're narrow enough for you to be able to touch the walls, you can shoot yourself with incredible speed through the plane, almost like a body slide. But anyway, fast-moving mid-air streams and rivers have a tendency to spray outward, filling the air with an oily mist that coats the walls in a slippery film, as most of the water in the plane is rather foul. And in some cases, it's hardly even correct to call it water. And beware, too, because some of the streams form the headwaters of the river Styx. The river Styx runs through and magically connects all of the lower planes. The Styx, at least in D&D, is a river of forgetfulness. In most places, just touching the water will rob you of your memories. But here, on the outskirts of the lower planes, it's not as much to worry about. The waters aren't as deep and not as steeped in evil, and not quite as repugnant and oily, so touching them doesn't have any ill effect. Drinking them, though, does. If you drink the Styx waters and fail your saving throw, you forget your entire life. And even if you succeed, you forget the entire past day. So even though there's water in most tunnels, it's generally not a good idea to drink it, because you never know if it's going to be Styx water. And then you're going to get caught in a potentially never-ending loop of drinking the water, forgetting that you drank it, and drinking it again, like Job repeatedly roofing himself in Arrested Development. The other danger of the Styx is that in some places the streams run extremely fast, so if you fall in, you can get swept away to anywhere else in the lower planes. And you can bet that wherever you end up is going to be at least equally as bad as where you came from. But all of that information was mostly from this book, from 2nd edition. Pandemonium is a bit different in other editions. In 1st edition, it's pretty much the same, except the caverns at their largest, mostly in the first layer, are thousands of miles wide rather than hundreds, and the winds at their strongest can only lift 100 pounds into the air, which are some mighty winds, but not enough to throw around most creatures. In 3rd edition, it's not the continued exposure to the regular winds of Pandemonium that causes madness, but rather it's the terrible windstorms that have a 10% chance per day to blow through any given area. In 4th edition, there are no outer planes, as that edition uses the world axis cosmology instead of the Great Wheel cosmology of Planescape. So there's the mortal world with its 2 parallel planes, the Shadowfell and the Feywild, and then the fundamental planes, the elemental chaos with its elemental realms, and the astral sea with its astral dominions. In this cosmology, Pandemonium is an astral dominion. There's a dark and tempestuous region of the astral sea, and if you press in closer to the roiling magenta-purple clouds of the color veil, the wind grows into a roaring gale, and then you burst through, suddenly finding yourself in a vast cavern, with the clouds behind you having changed into a cold black stone. To get back out, you need to fly through the howling black rifts in the outer walls of the plane, and pierce through the endless hurricanes surrounding the plane. Many who try fail, wrecking their vessels and finding themselves stranded here. The plane is still a desolate and dismal maze of dark tunnels blasted by fierce winds, but the gravity is normal and the whole place is only 600 miles across, but it wraps back around on itself, creating a sealed maze world that no one has ever fully explored. In 4th edition lore, Pandemonium was once the dominion of Tharizdun, the chained god, the god of darkness, insanity, and annihilation. But he abandoned it shortly after creating it, instead seeking out the elemental chaos to plant the Oberith Shard of Evil, thus creating the Abyss. There is no citadel or palace to Tharizdun here, but it still bears his mark. Its lightless, winding tunnels, its bone-numbing chill, and its maddening winds are just as Tharizdun made them all those eons ago. And because this place was created by him, and was for a brief time his place of power, at least according to this lore, a small number of Tharizdun's ancient servants can be found lurking in the depths. I do find this lore to be a bit contradictory with other 4th edition lore, though, because this book says that it was the Shard of Evil that corrupted Tharizdun and drove him to madness and evil. The Oberiths wanted him to plant the shard in the astral sea, but even in his new madness, he recognized that planting the seeds so close to his fellow gods would give them the opportunity to stop him before he could seize the power the shard offered. So he planted it in the elemental chaos instead, on the other side of the cosmos. So my question is, if Tharizdun created Pandemonium, but wasn't insane and evil until after finding the Shard of Evil, then why is Pandemonium a plane of darkness, evil, and insanity? He couldn't have made it before he found the Shard then. So did he find the Shard, spend some time creating Pandemonium, and then leave? I feel like that doesn't really make sense. Did he plant the shard in the elemental chaos, then just leave the demon lords to fight over it while he built Pandemonium, only to come back to the Abyss and get imprisoned there? I feel like that doesn't make sense either. So where in the timeline does the creation of Pandemonium fit in here? As I mentioned briefly, Pandemonium is the least populated and loneliest of all the outer planes. Given their infinite size, every outer plane is bound to have vast regions that are virtually uninhabited, but none are so desolate and deserted overall as Pandemonium is. Many of the people living here are here for that very reason. Pandemonium is a good plane to hide in. Many of the others aren't here willingly, but more about that in a bit. And while you can potentially find any race or species living in this plane, there are no natural inhabitants of Pandemonium, at least not people. They've all come from somewhere else. So, unlike many of the Outer Planes, Pandemonium has no signature race. In fact, 1st edition says that there's no native life at all. I don't think that was actually true, though, even in 1st edition, but still, it does give you some sense of just how barren this plane is supposed to be. When you die in D&D, at least in normal circumstances, your soul goes on to one of the Outer Planes to live out your afterlife. Or rather, your second life, as you can die again. And that time, it's typically more permanent. If you have a patron deity, you'll go to that deity's realm in whatever plane that realm resides. If you don't, you'll go to whatever plane best matches your alignment. In either case, you're called a petitioner. The petitioners of Pandemonium, no matter what god they follow, or if they're just general petitioners of the plane itself, all have some shared traits. Naturally, they're all insane. For regular people, the longer you live in Pandemonium, the worse your insanity will get. But petitioners often have some amount of resistance to the negative effects of the plane they call home. So while they still are mad, their madness is almost never serious enough to completely debilitate them. They're still functional, but it is almost always distracting and inconvenient for anyone dealing with them. They're also immune to spells that cause madness or similar effects, such as confusion, feeble mind, Otto's irresistible dance, or Tasha's hideous laughter, to name a few. Another trait that I've already mentioned is that they don't give off any body heat, which means they're invisible if you're relying on infravision to see. Some say that this so-called protective coloration is a sort of defense mechanism to make them safe from the Tanari raiders from the Abyss, who would otherwise capture them and force them into service in the Eternal Blood War. They can be seen just fine with normal vision, though, supposing you have a light to see by in the first place. But such lights are completely unnecessary for the petitioners themselves, as they basically have true dark vision in that 3rd edition sense, where they can just see perfectly fine in complete darkness, out to 120 feet. Technically, though, they're not actually using sight to do this. It's more like radar, or something like Toph's blind sense from Avatar: The Last Airbender. And the wind does interfere with this radar. So in the windiest places, their sight only extends to 30 feet. But the petitioners are specially adapted to the wind. They're all thin and bony, skeletal really, with angular, sharp features and smooth, hairless skin, and they typically wear next to no clothing. All of this makes them quite aerodynamic, drastically reducing how much they get blown around. They also have overly large feet with clawed toes, and another claw on their heels, and unnaturally long, clawed fingers, giving them a fantastic grip on the walls, so that when the winds are really surging, they can just cling onto the walls and let it wash over them, while others get picked up into the air and carried miles down the dark passages, likely to their deaths. Most of the Outer Planes are home to a faction or a sect, and despite being so underpopulated, Pandemonium is no different. Factions are those groups with real power in Sigil, the City of Doors, and are vying for control over the hearts and minds of the people of the Outer Planes. Each faction has a different view of the multiverse and where ultimate meaning is found. Sects are organizations that have no real foothold in Sigil. You can still find members of any given sect in Sigil, they just don't have any real power there or official duty like the factions do. The Bleak Cabal is the faction whose headquarters is in Pandemonium. Unlike pretty much all of the other factions, the Bleak Cabal claim that there is no meaning to the multiverse. So the members of this faction are nihilists, or existentialists, or optimistic nihilists, because they don't believe in any external source of meaning, but they do believe that there might be such thing as inner meaning. Don't look for meaning out there. Simply accept what happens without question and look inward. The Cabal believe that the multiverse makes no sense, and that finding a meaning inside yourself is the only way to avoid going crazy. But that's a daily struggle for the Bleakers, also called madmen because of the fact that it's not uncommon for them to fall into what's known as the Grim Retreat, an intense melancholia and madness over the pointlessness of life and the futility of all action. The Bleakers see the world as a merciless place, and yet they believe that that's exactly why mercy is needed most. So they're a very altruistic bunch. In Sigil, their headquarters is the Gatehouse in the city's Hive Ward. It's an insane asylum, almshouse, and orphanage. There they look after the downtrodden of Sigil, including many of their own who have fallen into the Grim Retreat. They also run soup kitchens all throughout the city. Their Factol, or leader, is a half-orc named Lar. He's been Factol for 3 years, which is actually the second longest tenure of any Factol the Bleak Cabal has ever had, as there's a strong tendency for them to commit themselves into the Mad Bleaker wing of the Gatehouse and never come out. In Pandemonium, their headquarters is a town called the Madhouse, which I'll describe later. The Bleak Cabal thinks that existence is madness, and so they feel a real affinity to Pandemonium. They believe that the madness that Pandemonium brings is the path to understanding. The only meaning, if there is any at all, is what's found within. And to them, there's no better way to learn that than by driving yourself crazy in the winds of Pandemonium and finding that after all that, you still have individual goals and desires to accomplish. I do think that the Bleak Cabal fits the madness aspect of Pandemonium, and with their altruism, it makes sense that they would choose to go to such a bleak plane and provide their support there, but I feel like they really don't fit alignment-wise, as the Bleak Cabal is easily the most morally upstanding faction there is, and yet in some passages, the Bleak Cabal seem to be evil, such as this bit in the 2nd edition Player's Primer to the Outlands, which is very out of character for the faction. One answer for this discrepancy is that the members of the Bleak Cabal start out good and are drawn to Pandemonium to experience the madness on offer, and then prolonged exposure to Pandemonium's evil turns them a bit evil too. I could imagine Bleakers traveling to Pandemonium, slowly growing more embittered and evil, and then going back to Sigil to shake off all that evil and essentially detox. Another group that can be found in Pandemonium, though they aren't by any means an official group, are the Banished. They're more of a class of inhabitants. The Banished is the collective label for all of the diverse peoples of the plane, or descendants of the people, who have been transported to this plane by others, such as offended gods or powerful wizards. You see, Pandemonium is a rather popular plane to banish people to, be they enemies, test subjects for advanced spells, or just groups of people who are in the way. For instance, if there's a goblin tribe encroaching on your land, hire a nearby wizard to just mass teleport them all somewhere else. Of course, it is possible that whoever you send here will find their way out, but many of them seem to stay. For some, it's because they never do find their way out. Pandemonium is a dark and winding maze of tunnels, after all, and there's always a good chance you go crazy rather quickly, which is sure to be a hindrance on your ability to escape. For some, it's because it's just easier to make a new life where you ended up than to go through all of the effort of finding your way back to the reality you used to know and then taking your home back from the guy who banished you, especially if you're just some low-level nobody. And for some, they actually find Pandemonium a convenient place to hide out for a while. After all, if someone is powerful enough to banish you here, maybe it's best to stay off their radar, and they might not have been your only enemy. But then, over time, this becomes the new status quo. A while becomes a lifetime, and a lifetime becomes multiple generations. While the Banished aren't unified as a whole, groups of them typically clump together in little insular communities, mistrustful and at least partially hostile to all outsiders. Most of the Banished you'll find here are those who are well suited to this environment. Not because they're the ones most likely to get banished in the first place, but because they're the ones most likely to survive afterward. It's a survivorship bias kind of thing. They're mostly goblinoid clans, but also Dwergar, Drow, some gnomes and halflings, and even a few ragged bands of humans. You might find some groups of demons and undead as well. But a question I have, which I don't think has any sort of official answer, is why is Pandemonium such a popular place to banish people to? Because it's not like this is the hardest plane to leave. If the purpose of banishing people is to keep them gone, you'd think you'd choose the prison plane of Carcery or the soul-draining grey waste of Hades. But one answer might be, it's not the most popular choice. Perhaps it's equally as likely a candidate plane to banish people to as, say, Carcery. It's just so underpopulated that the amount of people banished here becomes noticeable. If there are 500,000 banished creatures in a plane of 40 billion, it's hardly even noteworthy. If there are 500,000 banished creatures in a plane of 4 million, that's pretty noteworthy. Another answer might be, as a wizard, you don't want to draw too much attention to yourself. You don't want to make people angry by teleporting a horde of goblins right to their doorstep. So maybe you choose the least populated plane because of that. It has the lowest chance of backfiring on you by upsetting some god or demon lord or whatever. I mean, when you cast a spell like that, do you really know exactly where they're going to end up? Probably not. Another answer might be, you don't want to feed the blood war. If you're banishing someone, you probably don't like them very much, and so you don't want to send them to an upper plane, or upset the creatures of the upper planes by sending evil creatures there. But you're also powerful enough to be conscious of the whole potentially multiverse-ending war that's raging between the demons and devils, and you don't want to give either side fuel. So you choose the dark, winding, maddening, desolate plane where there are probably the lowest amount of successful demon raids looking for souls. But within that unofficial class of people known as the Banished, there is an official group, a sect, called the Dispossessed, also called the Exiles or Chippers. They form a sort of loose fellowship with secret handshakes, passwords, and recognition signals. While they technically are banished themselves, they view that as a derogatory term, at least when it's used about them. They have no issue using it to refer to the rest of the Banished who haven't joined their sect. Most of the Banished do have a grudge against the rest of creation due to the fact that they've been banished, but the Dispossessed take it to the next level. And where the Banished are by and large stuck in Pandemonium for whatever reason, the Dispossessed aren't. But they take their banishment, that combination of victimhood and entitlement, around with them. Because life has cast them aside, treating them as unworthy, they seek to prove their worth to the rest of the multiverse. So they wander the rest of the planes, picking fights to show that they're the real deal, eventually working their way up to the person who originally exiled them, to finally get their revenge. At that point, once they've achieved their goal, if they didn't die in the process, who's to say what they do? It probably depends on the psychology of the individual. Some may then leave the Dispossessed, having gotten over their inferiority complex. Some may stay in the sect and go back to Pandemonium to mentor others in their own journeys of revenge and validation. Some, even after their triumph over their rival, may never get over their own insecurities and seek out ever-escalating challenges until it finally kills them. The Dispossessed have the strongest presence in Pandemonium, because that's where the sect got started and where so many people get banished to. But there's also a lot of them in Carcery, because that too is a popular plane for banishment. And since the people of Sigil tend to think that their city is the center of the multiverse, you can find a good amount of the Dispossessed in Sigil too, trying to show the Cagers, or citizens of Sigil, that they're not such hot stuff. Another group of people in Pandemonium are the Cynosure, a group of performers who wander the first layer, Pandesmos. But since they're pretty much just located in that layer, I'll talk about them in that section of the video. Even though Pandemonium is a desolate plane, that doesn't mean it's completely empty. There are still all sorts of creatures to find throughout this plane, and you'll still run into them on your adventures. That would be pretty boring otherwise. The creatures that can be found here include those from the neighboring planes, passing through, such as Tanari, Slotty, or Githzerai. There's also Yugoloth mercenaries, Beatezu on sabotage missions, Garoleths, night hags, gremlins, or even demon lords hiding out for one reason or another. And while the Styx does run through this plane, you won't find many of the creatures who call that river home, such as Morenoloths, as the river is mostly too shallow in this plane for it to be worth inhabiting or visiting. Though there are all sorts of more natural creatures living in the wet caves, like giant snails, slugs, leeches, albino eels, crabs, and so on. But I'm mostly just interested in the creatures that this plane is known for, either ones that only live here or primarily do. Those include the Howler, Murska, Vilch, Howling Dragon, and Darkweaver. Howlers are 8-foot-tall, 4-legged beasts with gnarled fingers and hooved back feet. They have backs like oxen, scales, red fur, quilled necks, and monkey-like faces. While fearsome and cruel, they're mostly scavengers, and are rather cowardly, only attacking when they outnumber their opponents, which means that when they do choose to attack, they're rather formidable. Howlers are native to Pandemonium, and aren't naturally found in any other plane. They stay away from settlements and small tunnels, preferring larger caverns that basically act as plains and grasslands. Howlers are named for their howls that cut through the whistling wind of Pandemonium with the pitch of madness, bearing the same effect as the wind, gradually driving those who hear them to insanity. Normally, shelter provides some relief, but their howls pierce right through, affecting all in hearing distance whether they're indoors or out. though their howls can never bring you beyond stage 3 of wind madness, so at least there's that. Some believe that their howls contain the secrets of the plains, a code concealed in their pitch and song, but others think that only those who have been howled into madness believe that. Luckily, they don't howl all the time, most often when they're challenged or cornered, or in the case of howlers used as mounts or pack animals by the inhabitants of the plane, when they're lonely. They make for rather prized mounts, as they're well suited to traveling through the twisting tunnels of the plane. Murskas are also natives to the plane. They're horrid giant beetle creatures, about 8 feet long, except it's rare to see them in their true form. They travel around the plane, typically in groups of 3 to 4, hunting for meat. They'll eat essentially any creature, including each other, except for howlers. Supposedly, they find their quills irritating. When they eat a creature, they molt their shell, and their new form that emerges assumes the shape of their last meal. Though rather than transforming into an exact replica, their new skin stretches over their insectoid shell, so that they look more like a grotesque parody of what they ate. Then the skin molts off again as it's gradually replaced by their true form. So if you ever see one that looks completely like a beetle and not at all like something else, that means that it's been a long time since its last meal, and it's starving. Naturally, this is when they're at their most dangerous, but they can be incredibly dangerous at other times too, because they don't just assume the skin of their victims, but some of their intelligence, memories, and personality too. If a Murska eats a human, for example, it will appear mostly human, and will gain human intelligence for a time, as well as the ability to speak, which can help it lure others to their doom. They say that once a Murska tastes the fruit of intelligence, they grow a thirst for it and continually seek it out. The Revolutionary League, a faction of Sigil who often act as spies in the city, believe that Murskas are the spirits of their lost brethren, forever assuming the identity of others. Sometimes, if they're desperate, they even seek them out, hoping that these so-called god beetles will grant them aid. I think you can guess how that turns out. Vilches are hateful creatures native to Pandemonium that look like 3-legged mandrills. They like to cause chaos and destruction wherever they go. The more beautiful and orderly something is, the more they want to destroy it. While they can be deadly, they typically prefer just to cause pain and suffering rather than actual death. Howling dragons are the brilliant, scheming, and insane dragons native to Pandemonium. They're long and slender, with short, thin legs, frilled heads, and yellow, feral eyes. Though these eyes are clearly red. Not sure why that is. Their scales are purple and black, but get darker as they age. They keep their lairs in isolated caverns, but they roam far and wide, eating any moving thing they can find, even constructs and undead. Darkweavers dwell in the caves and dark places of some of the chaotic planes, such as the Abyss and Limbo, but they can be found in Pandemonium in particular, though some say they originated in the demiplane of Shadow, which you could think of as the pre-Shadowfell. Darkweavers are spider-like creatures with an amorphous, shadowy form like an oily darkness that clings to cavern walls or pools in deep shadows. However, if you were to dispel this aura of darkness surrounding them, you'd find a deeply unsettling, spherical, rubbery body with wiry tentacles and thick, feeding proboscises. They create webs of gloom and shadow, which are difficult to detect because their layers are already so dark. These webs can span for miles through twisting tunnels and dank caverns, appearing insubstantial at first. You can pass your hand through them and feel only an eerie, oily chill, and shining a light at them will make them fade away like slithering snakes. When you enter the outer layers of a Darkweaver's web, the distance you can see drops to half what it normally is. The web allows you to easily move toward the center, but in trying to move back out, you'll find that the shadows cling to you and try to prevent your escape, and that the strands no longer retreat from your light. It gets even worse the deeper in you go. And while in the Darkweaver's web, it can manipulate the thoughts and emotions of its victims until they willingly walk to the center. Darkweavers are intelligent and cunning creatures, and like to lure their prey with tricks and false promises. In 2nd edition Planescape, there are 10 schools of magic: Abjuration, Alteration, Conjuration, Divination, Enchantment, Illusion, Evocation, necromancy, wild magic, and elemental magic. In 5th edition terms, alteration is instead called transmutation, and wild magic and elemental magic are not considered schools. All of the outer planes have their own unique effects on magic. Some schools are diminished, some are enhanced, some are altered, and some are nullified. It depends on the plane. Also keep in mind that some spells have planar pathways, meaning they act on the magic of a particular plane. And if the plane you're in isn't directly connected to the one whose powers you're calling upon, the spell can't be cast. For instance, Speak with Dead calls on the memory cores floating around in the astral plane, and so you need to either be in the outer planes, the astral plane, or the prime material plane to be able to cast it. In Pandemonium, alteration, conjuration, divination, necromancy, wild magic, and elemental magic are affected. Alteration spells are affected by the chaotic and evil nature of the plane, particularly for spells that reshape or call material into being, such as Alter Self or Polymorph. The chaos gives these spells a shorter duration, and the evil causes them to look, smell, sound, and feel slightly foul. Conjuration is affected in all of the outer planes in the sense that since the outer and inner planes aren't directly connected, any elementals you summon are actually pseudo-elementals instead. In addition to that, in Pandemonium, the spells Find Familiar, Wish, and Limited Wish don't work at all. Due to the dark and chaotic nature of this plane, the outcome of divination spells is murky. Whenever you cast a spell from this school, the DM makes a secret roll to determine whether the spell operates normally or provides misleading information. Because this is a lower plane, necromancy spells that generate life, such as Reincarnate or False Life, are harder here, requiring the caster to pass an intelligence check. Other types of necromancy spells, like ones that create undead or deal damage, work normally. Because of the plane's extreme chaoticness, wild magic is enhanced here. In 2nd edition, where wild magic is a school of magic, many wild magic spells have some element of randomness, like in how much damage they deal, how long they last, or how large the effect is. So whenever you cast one of these spells, you roll to determine this. In Pandemonium, you roll twice and take the more extreme result. In 5th edition terms, I would say that would translate into wild magic sorcerers triggering wild surges more often, perhaps twice as often, perhaps even rolling twice and treating each roll independently, potentially causing 2 wild surges at once. That could be fun. I mentioned a moment ago that when you summon elementals, they're actually pseudo-elementals. Pandemonium is a plane of rock and wind and a bit of water, but no fire. So the way that the elemental school of magic is affected is that you cannot summon fire pseudo-elementals. Plus, because of this plane's alignment, any pseudo-elementals you do conjure will be tinged with madness and evil and will be harder to control. And one thing I don't think I've mentioned before in any of my videos, because I think I've just missed it up until now, is that it takes using spell keys to summon pseudo-elementals at all. So that means in Pandemonium, there are no spell keys to make summoning fire pseudo-elementals possible. Spell keys are how you avoid all the unwanted changes to spellcasting in other planes. Each plane has unique spell keys. Sometimes there are general purpose keys, sometimes they vary by school or by spell level or even by particular spell. And spell keys, despite the name, are not necessarily physical objects. They can be, but they can also be immaterial things, such as actions or words. Because Pandemonium is the plane of wind howling through rock, spell keys combine these things. Flutes, whistles, jugs, and things like that, carved from Pandemonium stone, serve the general purpose, but the individual keys themselves are discordant tones and sequences of tones as air moves through them. The more grating and discordant, the better, and they have to be loud enough to be heard over the plane's screeching wind. Because the key to proper spellcasting on this plane is so inherently musical, if you can even call it that, lots of bards come here to experiment, though most walk away without having learned much, but forever after have an edge of madness to their music. But in Pandemonium, spell keys can't solve all your problems, because this plane is somewhat unique in that not only does the magical nature of the plane affect spellcasting, but so too does the physical nature of the plane. In D&D, spells require spell components. There's somatic components, which means movement of your hands, vocal components, which means words you have to speak, and material components, which means physical items that you have to either just have on you or expend in the process of casting a spell. The somatic components are pretty much unaffected, but the winds of Pandemonium cause trouble for the other two. In many places throughout the plane, the wind is strong enough to blow the material spell components out of your hands as you're trying to cast the spell. To avoid that requires succeeding on a dexterity check. And then, because the wind is so loud, the chance of miscasting a spell is increased. The exact amount is up to the DM in how noisy they imagine it to be. I guess what this tells you about magic is that successfully casting a spell doesn't just require that your mouth utters the correct syllables, but that the universe hears them. Or perhaps the idea is that not being able to hear yourself clearly can cause you to misspeak. And then spells that operate based on causing sound can have their effects diminished or negated, such as spells like Suggestion or Message, or ones that deal sonic damage, or in 5th edition terms, thunder damage. In most places throughout the plane, these spells function normally within 10 feet of the caster, but beyond that, they might be completely negated, once again depending on DM discretion of how far out they might function or what the chances of negation are. But do people even play with spell components anyway? Spell keys are certainly one of those things that's pretty optional, as it can bog down gameplay with fiddly rules, and it can make it less fun for the players, as there's suddenly requirements and qualifications on all the spells they know. But I feel like the same thing is basically true of spell components. In my experience, and maybe my experience isn't representative of the whole, players and DMs alike just don't pay attention to them. It's one thing to know what all the spells in the player's handbook do, and I doubt most DMs do, but it's something else entirely to also know the spell components for each spell. It gets to a point where it's just a ridiculous amount of cognitive load for the DM, considering all the other things they have to track and pay attention to. So if you don't know it all off the top of your head, then the alternative is to interrupt gameplay every time one of your players casts a spell to check whether they have the spell components, or to just not care about that and let them cast it anyway. The upside of that is that gameplay is interrupted less often by looking up rules, and the player's ideas are squashed less often, but the downside is that magic is way more powerful than the game intended. Complications like, your hands are tied, and that spell has somatic components, or you can cast that spell, but since it has verbal components, it will make noise and alert the guards. Or, sure, you can cast Revivify. Do you have a diamond worth at least 300 gold pieces? Can actually enhance the fun and add to the problem solving and the need for tactics. And it also provides a way to make various situations and places feel different, at the cost of more rules overhead. So, now that you know a bit about what Pandemonium is like, who lives there, and what to expect as a spellcaster, how do you actually get there? Well, for starters, why would you even want to do that? It's a lower plane, so that should automatically tell you it's a horrible place to visit. But Pandemonium is much more immediately horrible than just about any other lower plane. Sure, you might get your will to live drained away in the Grey Waste, or spit roasted by demons in the Abyss, but those things won't happen to you immediately. Here, you will likely immediately regret coming. But if you insist, the usual options work just fine, provided you have access to them. Spells like Plane Shift, Gate, or Astral Projection, or items like Cubic Gate or Staff of the Magi. And if you do travel through the astral plane, the color pools you're looking for, which are the astral plane's version of portals, are magenta. You can also take a portal from Sigil, which is called the City of Doors because of the fact that it's so chock full of portals. Your best bet for finding portals to Pandemonium is in the Hive Ward, which is the city's shadiest ward, where the Gatehouse is, the Bleak Cabal's headquarters. Typically, each faction headquarters in Sigil is home to a gate to their plane of primary influence, and that's true for the Gatehouse. But it's also typically the case that the factions don't just let people use their portal. So if you want to use it, maybe wait in line outside the Gatehouse, pretending to be sick, starving, or crazy, and then take a sneaky look around once you're eventually let inside. Or just become a Bleaker. There's usually a year of hazing where they act as if you're not a member before it's official though, so that's not a great option if you're trying to get there quick. If you're elsewhere in the Outer Planes, you could try to find a portal from Pandemonium's neighboring planes, Limbo, the Abyss, or the Outlands. And by the way, these portals in Pandemonium always look like flat squares on the side of the caverns. Yellow goes to Limbo, red goes to the Abyss, and black to the Outlands, though there is a 20% chance that a portal will send you to one of the other two planes instead. If you're coming from the prime material plane, things are a bit harder. You could find a conduit leading here, which would most likely be found in deep dark tunnels, but there is always the interplanar pathways, which are mystical connections between several planes. There's the river Oceanus, whose pure waters connect some of the upper planes, the river Styx, whose foul currents connect all of the lower planes, Mount Olympus, whose caves and mountainsides connect all the planes where the Greek pantheon has influence, Yggdrasil, whose branches and roots do the same for the Norse pantheon, and the Infinite Staircase, whose winding paths reach all of the outer planes. The only ones Pandemonium isn't connected to are Mount Olympus and the river Oceanus. Generally speaking, the outer planes and the inner planes are not connected. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, this affects things like spellcasting. I also always took this to mean there weren't meant to be portals that connect the outer and inner planes, but if that is meant to be a rule, it's a very inconsistent one, as portals of this nature can be found scattered throughout the 2nd edition Planescape books. One such portal is called the Howling Gate, connecting Pandemonium with the quasi-elemental plane of Vacuum. It's always open, and the chaotic winds of Pandemonium constantly rush into it. So if you're not careful, you can get yanked straight into it. But that's on the Pandemonium side. If you happen to already be in the quasi-plane of Vacuum, though I don't know why you would be, as it's even emptier than Pandemonium, that's one way to get here as well. Another way that you could get here is by dying, after having led a life of the right alignment. If you were chaotic neutral, you'd go to Limbo. If you were chaotic evil, you'd go to the Abyss. And if you were right in between, you'd go to Pandemonium. Though, of course, you've got to be chaotic neutral enough to actually qualify. If you were kind of chaotic neutral, but mostly just neutral, you'd go to the Outlands. You could also get here after death if, in life, you had a patron deity who keeps their realm in Pandemonium. I can't imagine that applies to too many people, though. But, of course, as I mentioned before, the most popular way to get to Pandemonium is by being banished. Obviously, practically no one who gets banished wanted that to happen, but if you really want to get here, and the other options aren't doing it for you for whatever reason, find a powerful wizard and annoy him until he banishes you. And by that, I don't literally mean the banishment spell, as that wouldn't send you to Pandemonium, and only lasts for a minute anyway, at least in 5th edition. No, he'd probably cast Plane Shift on you. Though annoying a wizard is a dangerous thing, and I don't know why a wizard would waste a 7th level spell on you when Disintegrate is only 6th level. Plus, he's wasting a tuning rod worth 250 gold to cast it. So, I'm not even sure how all these people in Pandemonium are getting banished here. Even the 2nd edition banishment spell, which is much longer lasting, is only capable of sending creatures back to their home plane. I guess NPC wizards have access to magic not defined in the books. Either that, or there's some much more effective and cheaper spell than Plane Shift that I'm missing. Because otherwise, you think it would be much simpler to just kill people rather than banish them. But in any case, you're probably not eager to get banished here, so perhaps the most reliable means of entry is through Pandemonium's Gate Town. Each of the outer planes, except for the Outlands, of course, has a corresponding gate town in the Outlands. They're called gate towns because they're each built around a gate to their associated plane. They share many traits with the plane they lead to, serving as something of a sampler of what you'll experience when you step through the portal. But they can't become too similar, or else they'll get cosmically realigned, which is when a chunk of land from one plane magically moves to another plane when the people living on it act more in alignment with the other plane. Pandemonium's gate town is called Bedlam, which means scene of mad confusion, and that's pretty apt for the town, but I find the origins of the word pretty interesting. There was a priory in London nearly 800 years ago named St. Mary of Bethlehem. Apparently, a common way of pronouncing Bethlehem at the time was Bedlam, and the priory turned into a hospital, which then turned into an insane asylum, and that association stuck. The gate town of Bedlam is shaped like a giant fan. The base of the fan, where the gate is, sits at the bottom of a volcanic hill. From there, 8 worn-down roads spread out like spines up the slope. The town is divided into 3 districts. Not that any part of Bedlam is actually nice, But the top of the hill is the safest part of town where the nicest houses are, and where the roads are somewhat decent. This is the Citadel District. But things get worse as you go down the hill. Midtown is in the middle band where you'll find most of the inns and taverns, and the bottom of the hill is the Gatemouth District. The howling winds of Pandemonium constantly blow out through the gate, and in this district, that really shows. Things are at their most chaotic here, and shops and buildings are jammed together in every architectural style and literally nonsensical angles. Bedlam has a population of around 50,000, which if you compare that with the rest of them as listed in this book, it's the most populous of any gate town, which strikes me as rather odd. It makes sense on some level that a chaotic town named Bedlam would be overpopulated, but when you remember that Pandemonium is the least populated plane, it seems strange that it would have the most populated gate town. I guess the winds of Pandemonium that blow through the gate must have a lot to offer to attract people here, but they just don't want to actually go in and experience all the unpleasantries of the plane itself. Anyway, Bedlam's populace consists mostly of gnolls, bugbears, and humans, though there's a good mixture of other immortal races too. Most of the people who live here don't have a strong grasp on their sanity, to say the least. They're often compared to the people of Zeos, Limbo's gate town, except here they're malicious, petty, and hateful. One theory for why this is that the people of Zeos have come to terms with their madness, while the people of Bedlam haven't. Just don't let the Bedlamites hear you say that. Or this maliciousness could just be a result of exposure to the winds of Pandemonium. However, the winds certainly make you crazy, but evil? So I don't really think this adds up, because the people who live in the towns of Pandemonium itself don't seem to be quite so evil, as we'll see in the next sections. This passage even says that the Bleak Cabal, the strongest faction in town, often tries to talk people into going through the gate, usually resulting in their deaths. That seems like quite the sinister thing for the Bleak Cabal to do, who are otherwise extremely altruistic. It could be that the Bleak Cabal are doing it with good intentions, thinking embracing madness will show them truth, and the fact that they don't survive Pandemonium is an unintended side effect. But still, it kind of seems like the people of Bedlam are more evil than the people of Pandemonium. And that would make some sense, as it could be the primary thing keeping the gate town from crossing over to Pandemonium, except then the question would be, why doesn't it cross over to the Abyss? Perhaps the people of Bedlam really are steeped in an angry denial about their own insanity, while the people of Pandemonium are far too insane to be able to deny it at all. However, one point in favor of the idea that the winds cause this hatefulness is that the Gatemouth district is home to the most openly evil creatures in Bedlam. But anyway, the people of Bedlam are twitchy and self-absorbed, and many of them hear and even argue with imaginary voices. After a few days in Bedlam, you might start to hear voices yourself. The keeper of Bedlam is a wizard named Theric Bleakshadow, and he is actually a member of the Chaositex. He's completely senile, but also rather powerful, and is as much of a threat to his friends as his enemies, as no one knows what he'll do next, not even him. Lately, he's been complaining that some mysterious dark masters are plotting to overthrow him, which has caused him to burn several homes and inns to the ground. Each district of town has its own law enforcement group. The Citadel district has the Windlancers, and they're pretty much sane and reputable. Midtown has a semi-criminal group known as the Serix. Down in the Gatemouth district, there's a band of hapless adventurers trying to stem the tide of madness known as the Misguided. This book says they're actually petitioners, and that they call themselves the Guiding Lights. There's a few noteworthy spots in Bedlam. There's the Sanatorium, an insane asylum run by a Barriar priestess named Althax Darkfleece, hoping to cure the madness that the winds bring, whether those of Bedlam or Pandemonium itself. There's the Courthouse of the Damned, where there's no such thing as a fair trial, and punishment is guaranteed. The citizens of Bedlam keep an insane Modron Decaton by the name of Trictaculus imprisoned here to serve as judge. The Dark Draught and the Bone Chill Wind are both popular inns in Midtown, but perhaps the best place for travelers is Wayland's Inn. It's an island of quiet in an otherwise rambunctious town run by a dwarf named Pockmarked Wayland. The most popular tavern in the Gatemouth district is the Eye and Dagger. It's a common hangout for fiends run by a tiefling named Grist. But that's all 2nd edition. In 5th edition, Bedlam is a bit different. Instead of spreading out like a fan on a hill, it's a town nestled in a great crater. The gate is at the bottom. The town is made up largely of outlaws, recluses, and wastrels who squandered their fortunes elsewhere. They're still rather hateful. A typical Bedlam greeting involves spitting at the other person's feet and providing a creative insult. But the answer to the question of whether the winds induce the evil nature of Bedlam citizens is provided here. The bitter winds that constantly rack the crater erode the town, so repairs are never-ending, and everything not nailed down is as good as lost. And the winds gnaw at people just as they do the buildings, wearing away their patience, manners, and joy, infecting them with a contagious spite, and magically encouraging them to commit dark deeds against their neighbors. In 5th edition, Theric Bleakshadow is no longer the ruler of town. Apparently, he sought to plug the gate and stop the ceaseless influx of wind, but the gate reacted by simply changing direction briefly, sucking him in. Now, Bedlam is ruled by a cloud giant born in Pandemonium named Cirrus the Silent. None have heard her physically speak, but her words are carried on the winds to invade the minds of her subjects. There's still 3 districts in town, but the Citadel district has been renamed to Bleak Heights. The Eye and Dagger is still here, and it's the most popular plane in town in this edition, despite being in the cacophonous Gatemouth district. It's a mostly windowless building shaped like an upturned blade. The reason it's so popular is that it's blanketed in a silence spell, shielding the patrons from the belligerent gales of Pandemonium. But this silence is something of a double-edged sword, as it's a favorite spot for thieves and cutthroats. There's also a network of wind-eroded tunnels that originate in the Gatemouth district and extend up into Midtown, known as the Wailing Hollows. They're pitch black and inhabited by Darkweavers, mimicking the ecosystem of Pandemonium. Despite the danger, miners flock to the caves in search of Bedlamite, a valuable black ore that fumes with malice. So to clarify, 2nd edition uses the term Bedlamite to refer to the citizens, whereas in 5th edition it's an ore. Another location new to 5th edition is Witherbeak Observatory. It's set up on the cliff tops of Bleak Heights, an outpost of research and invention founded by a gnome mage named Professor Orbis Bumblewing. Her goal is to harness Pandemonium's chaotic winds for good, but her inventions are always either getting corrupted by the foul winds or commandeered by a gang of air genasi known as the Nimbus Knives. The gate itself is pretty similar between editions. It's at the bottom of the hill inside of a huge tower of black obsidian as tall as the hill itself, or crater in 5th edition.
The tower is topped by what looks like a humanoid hand reaching skyward.
Some say this tower is the arm of some forgotten god who tried unsuccessfully to escape from Pandemonium. In 2nd edition, it's simply known as the Black Tower. In 5th edition, it's called Sablereach, and the gatekeeper Cirrus the Silent lives inside the palm of the hand. The base of the tower has 6 entrances, called blast gates, that spew out the shrieking winds of Pandemonium day and night. It takes quite the effort to push through the powerful wind to reach the gate chamber. The chamber itself is lined with iron hand rings for visitors to avoid being blown off their feet. The portal is set within the chamber's ceiling, and you have to climb a massive chain to go through it. And I would imagine that if the gate led to a consistent location in Pandemonium, that there would be a town built up around it on the Pandemonium side. But since it's described as being a dangerous trip that often leads to people's deaths, I think we can assume that means the gate drops you off in a random location in Pandemonium's first layer, rather than anywhere safe. Though this book specifies that the 6 blast gates aren't just doors into the tower, but each a distinct portal to Pandemonium that drops you off in a different location. Pandemonium consists of 4 layers. The first is called Pandesmos. Because most portals and conduits leading to any particular plane lead to the first layer of that plane, Pandesmos is the most traveled of all of Pandemonium's layers. Though that's still not saying much. It's also marginally the least inhospitable, which isn't saying much either. This layer differentiates itself from the others in that it's where the winds are calmest. That's not to say that the winds are actually calm, or that they won't still drive you insane. They're just the least likely to blow you off your feet here, and there are more spots where the wind is quieter, and people have built up little towns in these pockets of relative safety. So it's the most populated layer. But don't forget that it still is generally a howling wasteland. This layer also has the largest caverns. First edition specifies that in Pandemonium overall, the caverns can get as large as hundreds of miles across and high, but in Pandesmos, you can find caverns that are thousands of miles across. Despite Pandesmos being this plane's most traveled and populated layer, there aren't very many described locations here. The first, and most noteworthy, is the town known as the Madhouse. This is the Bleak Cabal's headquarters, outside of Sigil. It's a sprawling citadel deep in the layer that serves as a way station for travelers. It was originally just a single walled inn with a maze-like interior that someone dubbed the Madhouse after getting lost inside. As the inn's popularity and size grew, the name stuck. Soon, other buildings began to collect in the area in a haphazard way, centering around the inn, catering to its needs, taking advantage of the fact that this was becoming the most popular spot for people in Pandesmos to pass through. As the settlement grew, it became a target for raids, so the citizens built some walls and posted some guards until a real town was born, with that central inn serving as the governmental building. The Madhouse is inside a tunnel roughly a half-mile in diameter, and so as the town continued to grow, it got to a point that it stretched around the entirety of the tunnel's inner circumference, meeting itself on the other side. So if you want to pass through this tunnel, you have to go through town. You wouldn't really get the sense that Pandemonium is a desolate plain if all you experience of it is the Madhouse, as the town is decently populated. The streets are full of people, and I'd imagine at all hours, because there's no such thing as a day-night cycle in this plane. And since the wind is always so loud, it wouldn't really make much sense for a town to have quiet hours. But since it's always preferable to be inside in this plane, to dampen the horrible wind, many of the people you'll find in the streets are there because they can't afford a house themselves. And there's also a lot of crazed petitioners in this town, going around twitching and yowling. So the town does live up to its name. The Madhouse is ruled by the matron of the inn, a paranoid female dwarf by the name of Maris Waro. She's a member of the Bleak Cabal, naturally, and has been the lady of the Citadel for about 60 years now, ever since she first came to see the glorious madness of Pandemonium. When she got to the Madhouse, the place was in complete disarray because the inn's old master had wandered off on a temporary trip 2 years earlier and never came back. Waro took it upon herself to set things in order, and by the time the townsfolk realized that she hadn't been sent officially by the Factol of the Bleak Cabal, they were already used to obeying her. But even though they do obey her, the Madhouse is hardly a model of order. It just manages to stay functioning in a chaotic plane full of chaotic citizens through the fact that Waro doesn't give too many orders, the town isn't too large for her to keep track of, and the locals aren't interested in challenging her rule. They are largely members of the Bleak Cabal, after all. They couldn't care less about who's in charge, though they do like to sometimes make jokes about what will happen when the master gets back from his trip. There are no real natural resources around the Madhouse to speak of. But there are merchants coming all the time and then realizing that it's terrible here and they want to get out as fast as possible. There's also the odd petitioner that stumbles in with some unusual find from the tunnels, like a rare gem that makes the merchants go crazy as they all scramble to get it. As a result of all of this, both what's for sale and the prices in town are incredibly unpredictable. One day there might be a surge of half-off magical swords, but no rations whatsoever. And the next week, the only thing for sale might be lanterns, but no oil to keep them lit. Other services in town are just as chaotic. Businesses change hands and buildings change function frequently. The inn that you stayed in last time you were here might now be a warehouse, though if you're a regular in town, you can learn the most dependable places. And if you're very well known, you might even get to stay in the original inn as a guest of the matron. Another major site in Pandesmos is the Cynosure. But it's not a consistent location. It's just as much a group of people as it is a place. You see, the Cynosure is a circus, a troupe of about 300 performers who wander around this layer in massive, fortress-like wagons. Though in actuality, there are far more than 300 people in this traveling caravan, as many flock to the Cynosure both for entertainment and for safety. They're known to put on some of the best and wildest shows that anyone's ever seen. And their main traveling fortress is a sanctuary like no other. Of course, more than half the Cynosure is more than half insane. The fact that a traveling troupe of performers is even out here is a testament to their insanity, but it's also a protection against insanity. The show runs continuously, and several acts perform at the same time, competing for the audience's attention, so there's always something to see. Like many things in Pandemonium, the Cynosure got started due to banishment. Long ago, a powerful wizard by the name of Unchar de Bebos, known as the Wandering Wizard because of his floating castle that he used to roam the prime material world he lived on, attracted some even more powerful enemies, and they banished him and his castle to Pandemonium. He began taking in other outcasts into the protection of his walls, and they sang songs and performed tricks for amusement and comfort. Eventually, word spread, and people started showing up to watch. Unchar grew to like being the center of attention, which is what the word Cynosure means, and so the Cynosure was officially started. Toward the end of his life, he proclaimed that the Cynosure should never stop moving, as no single location was worthy of hosting the show permanently. And so years and years after his death, the circus never stops in one place for long. Only his original castle floats. The other 58 wagons that make up the caravan, many of which are enormously large, roll through the tunnels normally, though they do like to take up the entire cavern that they travel through, rolling along all of the walls, not just one. The whistles and bells placed on the wagons manages to transform the howling wind into an oddly pleasing cacophony of sound, if still a bit maddening. The wagons are well illuminated too, with lights of all colors, making the Cynosure quite the vibrant sight to behold in an otherwise dark and dismal plain. The current leader of the Cynosure is an intensely bipolar and histrionic tiefling wizard acrobat named Apheliana. Confusingly, the members of the Cynosure also refer to her as the Cynosure, because she embodies the show like no one else. A noteworthy location elsewhere in Pandesmos is the Cavern of the Self, where the eternal winds have eroded the walls to the point that they're as smooth as glass. Every surface reflects light like a mirror. When you enter the Cavern of the Self, you see yourself reflected hundreds or even thousands of times all over the walls, presumably only if you have a light source. But each reflection is different. You see yourself in different stages of life or in different emotional states. One of the countless reflections is your true reflection at that moment in time. It's said that if you can spot it and concentrate on it, you'll gain a great insight into yourself and your relationships with all other creatures. Mechanically, that means the ability to cast Charm Monster as if you were 10th level once per day, up to 4 times until you return to the Cavern of the Self to do it again. But the cavern is also a suitable site for an ambush, as standing in the Cavern of the Self is rather disorienting, making it difficult to move around, what with all the reflections of yourself and the difficulty of discerning where exactly the walls begin and end. This site comes from a source book from 3rd edition that I've used in videos once or twice before for other things, but I kind of forgot about, and didn't realize it had so many little locations like this in it. Which is a real shame because there's a lot of these from planes that I've already covered that I didn't include in those videos. So I'm going to do some quick mentions here. I'll say their names and put some details about them on screen. In Mount Celestia, there's Imperia Mere, Destiny Point, and the Fields of Autumn. In the Grey Waste, there's Omor's Folly and Arthenmir's Wrath. In Mechanus, there's the Catalogues of Enlightenment. In the Abyss, there's the Silent Temple, Widow's Walk, Dweeblex's Grasp, and the Mausoleum of Icy Fear. In Sigil, there's the Metacube. In Limbo, there's Yondala's Teeth. In Arborea, there's the Spire of Thorns. And in Bitopia, there's the Peak of Continuation. There's also a few locations in Pandesmos from the Vecna Eve of Ruin campaign book. That one's still kind of a recent book, so spoilers for that adventure if you were planning on playing it. And it's worth noting that this adventure makes Pandemonium dark, but not pitch black. Toward the end of the adventure, when the players are 19th level, they go to a place in Pandesmos called Carapace Ridge, where the spidery forces of Lolth and Miska the wolf spider battle each other. It's a huge cliff overlooking a beach by the ruinous sea, which is a swirling sea of multicolored energy that devours anything it touches, except for the chaos krakens that call it home. Rumors suggest that the chaos of Limbo leaks into Pandemonium through the ruinous sea, though some think it's the elemental chaos that touches Pandemonium here instead. Lolth's forces are headquartered in the nearby Hurricane Tower, a 200-foot-tall tower jutting precariously from the top of the cliff, anchored in place with webs. Miska's forces are headquartered in the ruinous citadel, which sits on the beach at the edge of the ruinous sea, its chaotic energies hastening its erosion. Since the time of the Dawn War, the ancient conflict between the gods and the primordials triggered by Tharizdun's creation of the Abyss, at least according to the lore of newer editions, Miska the Wolf Spider has been imprisoned within a demiplane, only accessible through the ruinous citadel. Pandesmos is also where Vecna is conducting his big ritual to remake the multiverse in this campaign. There's a cave network called Vecna's Grasp. It's connected to all these little unrealities, demiplanes that exist outside time and space, manifestations of the new multiverse that Vecna is creating. Dispelling these demiplanes opens the way to Vecna's ritual chamber, a mythical place called the Cave of Shattered Reflection, with the ability to harness life forces and reveal fundamental truths to those inside. It's a cavern filled with an eerie purple light, with walls made of a translucent purple crystal. And all of the rest of the described locations in Pandesmos are the realms of the gods. This layer is home to 9 gods, though one of them is only here some of the time. There's Loki, Auril, Anshar, Eloile, Tuonatar, Tuoni, Homasubi, Talos, and Raxavort. Loki is the god of mischief and strife in the Norse pantheon. D&D incorporates many gods from real-world mythology, but there's usually differences between the D&D version and the real-world version. Loki is a vainglorious god. He's convinced that there's nothing another god can do that he can't, and he feels a need to prove that he's smarter than the rest of the pantheon. He likes to seduce goddesses too, less for the pleasure of their company, but more for the satisfaction of getting between a husband and a wife. He likes to spread lies and half-truths, and generally sow discord among the gods. He spends most of his time in the realm of Asgard, in the plane of Isgard, with the rest of the Norse pantheon, but he also keeps a realm here in Pandemonium. Whenever his trickster ways put him into too much trouble, he retreats to Pandemonium for a while until things cool off. Loki's realm in Pandesmos is known as Winter's Hall, a place of spite, trickery, and treachery. It's a hidden, snowy, blizzard-ridden region of Pandemonium, where visibility is limited to a few feet. Since the realms of gods often follow different rules and aesthetics than the rest of the plane they're in, I'm not sure if the visibility conditions here are bad only because of the blizzards, or because of the perpetual darkness of the plane plus blizzards. It's possible that Winter's Hall is illuminated. But the snow here never rests. It's always being whipped up by the winds and coating the hills and creatures of the realm in a layer of ice. The realm is full of wolves and lycanthropes, but their howling is drowned out by the howling of the wind, so you never can tell if you're being hunted by a wolf pack until it's too late. This realm has no towns. There's only a single great hall amidst the snow that serves as a gathering place for the giant warriors of this realm and their wolves, where they feast, boast about their achievements, and engage in all sorts of drunken and half-mad debauchery. Winter's Hall is primarily a realm of giants, though there are plenty of human, dwarf, and elf slaves here, captured by the giants during their raids into Isgard. Normally, Loki appreciates the company of humans, but he doesn't care for it here. Plus, whenever he's here, it's because he's offended his fellow Asgardian gods, which means he's never in a good mood in Winter's Hall. So it's not a very welcoming place to visit, unless you happen to be bearing a grudge against the Norse gods, a very good liar, or an entertaining bard. If you're not one of those things, you'll probably get branded as a Norse spy and subjected to some form of torture game or another. A common one, also used for servants who are sloppy with the ale, is for the giants to force you to dance in the fireplace until you catch fire. Since Loki is a trickster god, all roguish abilities are enhanced here, so you'll have better success picking locks, sneaking around, that sort of thing. And since he appreciates a good trick, anything you can manage to steal is considered fairly taken. Similarly, if you get captured by a giant, perhaps because they considered you a spy, and manage to slip free, you've earned your freedom. When Loki isn't here, this realm is ruled by a giant named Starkad the Gnar, though he's more interested in brawling, hunting, and wenching than decision-making, so he's a mediocre ruler at best. The real but unofficial ruler, then, is Ingrid the Serpent Tongue, the mistress of the hunt, a giantess who leads the hunts and provides most of the realm's food. Her command over the realm's hounds is such that all wolves, dogs, or canine creatures automatically become her servants upon entering the hall. In 4th edition, there's a place in Pandemonium that pretty much matches the description of Winter's Hall, except it's called Winter Vault. Winter's Hall is also the realm of Auril the Frost Maiden, the Faerunian goddess of cold and winter. She's the embodiment of winter's cruelty. There really isn't any information about what her section of this realm is like, at least in 2nd edition. In 4th edition, her realm is part of the Deep Wilds, which is an astral dominion epitomizing the raw force of nature. Her section of the Deep Wilds is known as the Land Under Eternal Ice, and her Winter Hall is a giant floating icy structure, pretty much a city, that moves around and brings storms and icy winds wherever it goes. Auril features prominently in the 5th edition campaign book, Icewind Dale, Rime of the Frost Maiden, where she's engulfed the entire northmost region of Faerun in an unending winter and night. This poem from that book sums her up pretty well. We bow to she who wears the crown, let the world shiver with dread. Clad in winter's whitest gown, her snow enshrouds the dead. Her fury sheds but frozen tears as grey clouds issue forth. Her wind across the wasteland shears, bringing blizzards from the north. Ice-kissed flowers caught mid-bloom, beauty kept in all its grace. Summer's gone to its silent tomb, stilling in her cold embrace. All the world in winter's white, sheathed in sleet and ice. Set upon never-ending night, she conjures paradise. Behold her everlasting rhyme, see how it covers all. Weep not for those she traps in time behind her glacial wall. Sovereign of summer's lost, general of winter's war, long live the queen of cold and frost, may she reign forevermore. Anshar is the Babylonian god of darkness and night. In real-world mythology, he's the primordial god of the sky, kind of like the equivalent of Saturn in Greek mythology. Both primordial sky deities, not actively worshipped in their time, but instead the fathers of the sky deity who was actively worshipped and considered the king of the gods. For Greek mythology, that's of course Zeus, but for the Mesopotamians, that was Anu. Anshar's realm is called the City of Eternal Darkness. It's tucked away in a place in Pandesmos where the winds die down to the merest whisper. There's a black brick wall that seals off the entrance to this realm. All light sources only illuminate 5 feet of this wall in any direction, so only those who are friends to the night can find the door into the realm. Within the realm, no light is permitted, and any who attempt to create light draw the attention of Anshar himself, and he's said to be easily angered. Apparently, he once had a lot more power than he currently does, having lost it to Anu. It takes belief and worship to make a god, so I suppose the idea would be that in ancient times, Anshar was the dominant deity of his peoples, but then he lost much of his worship to Anu, and therefore he lost much of his power too. Anshar shares this realm with Elewale, the Cerulean goddess of night, darkness, thieves, and deceit. Cerulia is the primary continent in the Birthright campaign setting, like how Faerun is the primary geographical region in the Forgotten Realms campaign setting. Elewale is not malicious, but she is capricious and selfish. She loves to embarrass or trick her enemies, sometimes with lethal results. She's said to live in every shadow and to hear all words whispered in secret. Some say she shares this realm with Anshar to bolster his diminishing power. Others think it's so she can take it from him when he becomes weak enough. Tuonela is the land of the dead in Finnish mythology, ruled by Tuoni and Tuonetar, the Finnish god and goddess of the underworld, respectively. Tuoni is darkness personified, though he sometimes takes on the form of an old man with 3 fingers on each hand and a hat of darkness. Tuonetar is the queen of the underworld and mother of diseases, demons, and monsters. In Finnish myth, Tuonetar gives visitors to the underworld a golden goblet of beer, but it's known as the beer of oblivion, because if you drink it, it causes you to forget that you ever existed, and makes you completely unable to ever return to the land of the living. Tuonela is a joyless place of grey mists and shrieking winds, full of people who have lost all desire and sense of purpose. Aside from the winds, it would fit right in the Grey Waste, but for whatever reason, it's here instead. Ho-Masubi is the Japanese god, or kami, of fire. He also goes by the name Kagutsuchi. In Shinto myth, Kagutsuchi's flaming body caused his mother to die while giving birth to him. For this, his father decapitated him and cut his body into 8 pieces, which became 8 volcanoes and gave rise to multiple other deities. In D&D, the only information about him is that he's a god of fire and his realm in Pandesmos is called Uchibi. I do find it strange, though, that a fire god has a realm in Pandemonium, as fire is specifically absent from Pandemonium otherwise. Talos is the Faerunian god of storms, destruction, and earthquakes. He's bullied a few other gods into working for him. They call themselves the Gods of Fury. Aside from Talos, it includes the Bitch Queen Umberlee, Malar the Beast Lord, and Auril the Frost Maiden. They're all evil gods, so it's not like Talos has bullied them into activities that they wouldn't be doing otherwise, just bullied them into being his underlings. Talos' only purpose in life is to prove that he can tear down whatever anyone builds. He's like a malicious little child who loves to decimate anthills and destroy other people's sandcastles. His realm is made up of 2 large, craggy towers on a hill, known as the Towers of Ruin, also called the Screaming Towers or the Towers at the Heart of the Winds, because of the winds that eternally curl around it in a helix. The towers share an entrance, somehow, and the winds grow to hurricane force as you get closer. Raxavort is the god of the Svarts, which are cruel, cowardly, blue-skinned, 3-foot-tall humanoids with receding hairlines and orange eyes. Technically, Raxavort is a demigod. He used to be the treasurer of the demon lord Grazit. After centuries watching over his treasures, he became lustful of his master's riches and plundered them. One of the artifacts he stole was the Infinity Spindle, a crystalline shard from the early days of the multiverse that can transform any creature into a demigod. But soon after Raxavort's ascension to godhood, Grazit dispatched his agents far and wide to track him down. To avoid his pursuers, he created the Svarts, creatures that are more or less exact duplicates of him, and also register as him to any magic meant to track him down. They share all of his flaws and few redeeming qualities. They are greedy, conniving, and full of hate for any creature they perceive as better than them, which is nearly every creature. Raxavort's realm is known as the Black Sewers, and it's where he hides from Grazit's wrath, too cowardly to leave, except every once in a while to claim the treasures of his devoted Svarts, leaving them with nothing in return. The second layer of Pandemonium is Cocytus. I'm not exactly sure the best pronunciation for this. I've always pronounced it Cocytus. Wikipedia says it's pronounced either Cocytus or Cocytus, but it seems people online generally prefer Cocytus, so I guess I'll go with that. The name comes from Greek mythology, where it's one of the 5 rivers of the underworld, the River of Lamentation. In Dante's Divine Comedy, Cocytus is the lowest circle of hell, where traitors go in death. In D&D, though, it's a bit different. I'm not exactly sure why D&D is so inconsistent with how they use real-world mythology. Sometimes they use it in pretty much the same way it was originally used, like with Yggdrasil connecting the various worlds of Norse mythology. And in other cases, they take an existing name and apply it in an only somewhat related, or even completely unrelated way, like how they use Acheron not as a river that flows into the underworld, but as an entire plane of existence all its own. Anyway, Cocytus does have some resemblance to its mythological namesake, as it's often called the Layer of Lamentation due to the sounds that the winds make here. Coming here, you'd think that there's thousands or even millions of tormented souls wailing and screaming, but it's just the wind. First edition specifies that the wind here causes insanity even quicker than in the other layers. The shrillness of the wind is one way that this layer differentiates itself from the others. Another is that the tunnels here tend to be smaller and twistier. In fact, they seem to have been carved intentionally, perhaps to make the wind sound this way. You can find what look like chisel marks all over the layer, but they've been smoothed down by the wind over the countless eons. Whoever dug these tunnels has been long forgotten. Many suspect it was some long-lost god of Pandemonium who went crazy. Some believe this god lost all their worshippers and is now a corpse in the astral plane, while others think the god is still hidden somewhere in Cocytus. Recently, there's been rumors in the madhouse in Pandesmos that some Burke has found an artifact from Cocytus capable of summoning back the layer's lost gods. Where Pandesmos is terrible, but somewhat well-trafficked, Cocytus is just terrible, so almost nobody comes here. It's simply too depressing. That does make it a good place to hide out, though, so it's not utterly deserted. It's just that the type of people you're likely to run into here aren't going to be the most friendly. For such an untraveled lair, there are a surprising amount of noteworthy sights and godly realms. In most places around Cocytus, the chisel marks that display the lair's unnatural origins are easy enough to miss, but there are some places where the handiwork of the ancients is far too prominent to ignore. The harmonica is one of them. As I said, the tunnels and caverns of Cocytus are generally small, but the harmonica is an exception. It's a spherical cavern about 10 miles in diameter, filled with hundreds upon hundreds of columns of various heights, riddled with holes of all sizes for the winds to rush through, filling the chamber with discordant, reverberating tones. At the low end of the spectrum, the sound is below the threshold of human hearing and causes a painful vibration in your bones. At the high end, the tones are so shrill that they can shatter glass and crystal and make your brain feel like it's on fire. The cavern walls are pierced with multiple hundreds of entrances, which means the site is accessible from all sides and is a meeting place for the winds from all corners of Cocytus. Some believe that the harmonica was built as an amphitheater for the gods. Others believe it's a ritual site for invoking dark powers. A few believe that it's the very heart of Pandemonium, driving the winds throughout the rest of the plane like blood through huge arteries of stone. Perhaps it's the entire reason that the tunnels of Cocytus were even carved in the first place. The harmonica is rumored to possess magical powers. Some believe that those who can find the very center of the cavern will receive immortality. Others say it will grant your deepest desire, but there's an equal amount of stories about the place granting curses rather than boons. Each of the columns have carved staircases spiraling up them, presumably so that people can find the center point of the cave. However, the steps are all waist-high for a human, making climbing quite taxing. Plus, the winds that pierce through the holes all over these columns can easily throw you off balance, or even fling you to your death. And perhaps the worst part is that only a few columns actually reach the center of the chamber, and since it's so dark in this plane and the columns are so tall, it's pretty much impossible to tell how high one goes without just climbing it. And since the chamber is so full of fierce winds, spells like Fly that require verbal or material components are virtually impossible to cast. By the way, this says somatic or material components, but I feel like that has to be a mistake. And keep in mind that gravity only orients to the walls of the cavern itself. So you can walk around the spherical chamber wall, but you can't just walk up the side of a column. Imagine tortuously climbing up a spire that's 4 miles high, with steps that are each 3 feet high, with the wind constantly threatening to send you falling to the ground, only to reach the top and discover that it doesn't even reach the fabled center of the harmonica. And now you've got to do it all over again, who knows how many times, until you find one that actually gets you there. Little wonder no one has ever done it and returned to tell the tale. Those who try either give up or die in the attempt. There's another site in Cocytus that is also something of a nexus point for the winds of Pandemonium. It's called Howler's Crag, and it's a jagged spike of stones in another immense cavern, sitting in the center of the lair, or at least what people consider the center. It's not a very impressive sight to behold, just a jumbled pile of stones, really, looking like a giant's palace collapsed in on itself. The top is a level platform about 8 feet across, surrounded by a low wall. And the lower section of the crag is riddled with small burrows, some of which are connected. What few travelers come to Cocytus mostly come for Howler's Crag. They say that it's one of the most reliable ways out of Pandemonium, that if you stand at the top of the crag and shout the name of your home, you get instantly transported there. They say that the crag is built on the grave of a once great god of travelers, portals, and planewalkers. It was supposedly a phoenix god and controlled the secrets of reincarnation. When other gods got jealous of its power, they destroyed it, and its corpse became the crag, and the remnants of its divine spark give the place its magic. Years ago, a group called the Brotherhood of the Phoenix took up residence in the burrows beneath the crag. Some believe that they have long since died out, as small altars can be found in the burrows, as well as strange alphabets on the walls, but no real sign of the Brotherhood's active presence. But others believe they're still in there, somewhere, digging to recover the body of their god. Unfortunately for the people who come here looking for a way out of the plane, the crag doesn't teleport you, no matter how loud you yell. But they also say that you can talk to anyone in existence from the top of the crag, that your words get transported to wherever in the multiverse they need to go to reach your intended recipient. And that is true. However, being a chaotic plane, this power isn't all that dependable. There's always a chance that your message gets delivered to the wrong recipient, or that the person who hears it ignores this mysterious voice on the wind for fear of going insane. This place is also a bit of a trap, though. The tip of the crag constantly glows a bluish fairy fire, making anyone up there easy to spot. Sometimes bandits will trap a person at the top, only letting them go after they pay a large ransom. Some people believe that these bandits are the remains of the Brotherhood of the Phoenix that have now turned to evil. 3rd edition adds that demons of various sorts have learned that visitors constantly trickle toward the crag, so they lie in wait to ambush them. But seeing as this may be the most heavily trafficked spot in the layer, there is hospitality to be found here as well. Nearby Howler's Crag, carved into the stone ground and secured against the wind, is an inn called the Laughing Mug. There's a staircase down marked by a single bright yellow lantern, leading to the inn's rusty iron door. The place is a rare oasis of comfort in an otherwise cold, windy, and dreadful lair. The innkeep is a thin human named Fat World, who always talks in questions. While you could try to seek shelter in the burrows of Howler's Crag, they're not sealed off from the wind like the Laughing Mug is, and rumors say that the ghosts of the Brotherhood of the Phoenix inhabit those tunnels. Fat World warns travelers to stay away from them, but some of those who believe the Brotherhood is still alive think that Fat World is somehow in league with them. One of the challenges you may face while traversing Cocytus is a stretch of about 300 feet of tunnel known as the Unseen Path. It's a path laid with fine cobblestones, clearly laid by some intelligent hand. The path wanders unpredictably from floor to wall to ceiling and back, and since you can walk on any wall in this plane, that sounds like it should be fine. But this tunnel has been enchanted so that if you wander off the path, gravity reverses itself, causing you to suddenly fall to the other side of the tunnel, which is about 50 feet. I'm actually not sure how that's supposed to work though, because if you get flung to the other side of the tunnel for not walking on the path, then when you hit the other side, you'd immediately just get flung again, unless you happen to land on another part of the path. You just get hurled back and forth repeatedly until you die. So I have to imagine that this enchantment either comes with a grace period of a few seconds for you to place your feet on the path again after falling, or that it makes sure that wherever you fall, you always land on a different part of the path. But what makes staying on the path challenging is that this entire passage is also enshrouded in an enchanted darkness, so it's very hard to see if you're placing your next step on cobblestones or not. Those who walk the entire length of the Unseen Path gain the ability to use dark vision once per day, up to 6 times until they return to walk the path again. And that's 3rd edition dark vision, so it's OP. Another location in Cocytus is the Shrine of Asarak. Asarak is a powerful lich, best known for his Tomb of Horrors in the various adventures of that or similar names. He's the guy on the 5th edition Dungeon Master's Guide, the original one. Somewhere in Cocytus, there's a vast tunnel studded with tombs and unmarked graves. The Shrine of Asarak is one of them. It's a sealed mausoleum of cold iron, with a great statue in the shape of a human skull standing in front of it, with jewel-like stones in its eye sockets and in place of the teeth. Anyone who kisses the statue is granted the ability to influence an undead creature, like a suggestion spell, but with no chance for failure. Once per day, up to 5 times until they return to the shrine and kiss it again. The other locations in Cocytus are all the realms of this layer's gods. 5 of them, which is more than I would expect, though depending on which edition you go by, there's only 4. There's Hrugek, Belinik, Erethnul, Sirik, and Garagos. Hrugek is the primary god of the bugbears. He's a god of violence and combat. There are a few other bugbear gods, but they're all suspicious of each other and solitary, so their realms are in different planes. Hrugek's realm is called Hrugekolak. It's a hidden realm, Not because Hruggick is a coward, but because he prizes caution and prefers sneak attacks and ambushes. Hruggick is set in an unusually honeycombed area of Cocytus, with an abnormally large number of standing pools. These pools are magically heated from within, allowing various forms of pallid, grub-like life to grow in them, which the bugbear petitioners hunt to sustain their villages. Deep in the center of the realm lies Hruggick's grotto, far away from all the petitioner villages. It's a foul cavern filled with the bones of Hruggick's victims, ringed with the severed heads of his enemies that through some magic only known to Hruggick perpetually howl with pleas for mercy and praises of Hruggick's strength. The heads are of all different races, and are said to contain some great power that can be used against the other members of whichever race they are. Many believe that the magics of the heads and the stagnant pools don't originate from Hruggick, as he's not that powerful of a god as far as gods go. Instead, they think that these magics were already here, perhaps remnants of the ancient gods who carved these tunnels, and he established his realm over them. Just like their god, these petitioners are very suspicious of outsiders, so they've set up traps all over the realm. The hand-carved stone of the lair makes these traps difficult to spot. Most non-bugbears who come here either end up as slaves or meat, or slaves and then meat. Even other bugbears end up as meat if they don't make a convincing demonstration that they worship Hruggick above all other gods. But some bugbears, such as Stinking Glock, the chieftain of the largest village, have been known to offer safe passage through the realm for those who provide enough coin. And if you don't offer enough, they're likely to take your money and lead you into a trap. Belinik is the Cyrillian god of battle, feuds, and fear. He embodies the belief that might makes right, and that strength and savagery are all a warrior needs. His realm is called the Striving. It's a monstrous cavern of squalling winds and blustery snow.
Wolves roam its wintry hills, and berserkers cut down any who stumble through the snow-drifted paths.
It's a place of treachery and isn't safe for anyone. The Long Hall of Belinik sits in the exact center of the realm, surrounded by a great wooden palisade and protected by a huge snow serpent. Inside the Long Hall, Belinik and his highest-ranking warriors feast and plan their next waves of terror. Erethnul, or perhaps you'd like to pronounce it Erethnul, is the god of hate, envy, and slaughter from the Greyhawk campaign setting, the crystal sphere known as Greyspace, as each of the worlds in the prime material plane are housed within crystal spheres, basically like bubble universes, or more accurately, solar systems. Erethnul's realm is called the Fields of Malice, but in 3rd edition he's instead got a realm in the 3rd layer called the Citadel of Slaughter, so I'll talk more about it in that section. Cyric is the Faerunian god of lies, trickery, and strife, though he's been the god of many other things, including tyranny, murder, death, intrigue, and illusion. Cyric has a very full history, but basically he was a mortal that killed Baal, the Faerunian god of murder, and claimed the power of the dead three, Baal, Bane, and Merkel. He also killed, or supposedly killed, Lara, the Faerunian goddess of illusion and deception. So he had a rather large godly portfolio. He then commissioned the creation of a tome, the Cyrinishad, that would magically convert any who read it to worship him. But then Cyric read the Cyrinishad himself, driving him insane. He ended up losing most of his gained portfolio and retreated to Pandemonium, believing himself superior to all other gods, so that he doesn't feel the need to waste his time on them. His realm has a few names: the Shattered Castle, the Castle of the Supreme Throne, or just the Supreme Throne. In the World Tree cosmology, which isn't really compatible with Planescape's Great Wheel cosmology, the Supreme Throne is its own plane. It's a ruined castle that rises above a desolate landscape where the wind's howls drive one mad. While the castle is nothing more than a crumbling ruin, in Cyric's deranged mind, it's a magnificent palace fit for the future ruler of the multiverse. The realm itself seems bent on crushing intruders, particularly those who refuse to bow before Cyric. Garagos, or Garagos, is the Faerunian god of war, destruction, and plunder. He used to be known as Targus, and was the primary god of war in Faerun during the time of the ancient Netherese Empire, but he was beaten by Tempest, who took that position from him. He's associated more with the destruction side of war than the tactics and strategies side. He used to be more merciful and even-tempered, and his realm used to be in limbo. But it seems he took getting overthrown by Tempest rather hard and became a bit evil. So his realm, known as Battleguard, moved here to Pandemonium to better suit his darker nature. The third layer of Pandemonium is called Phlegethon, not to be confused with Phlegethos, one of the 9 hells of Beator. Like Cocytus, it also shares the name of one of the rivers of the underworld from Greek mythology. But in this case, it's even less similar to its mythical namesake, as the Phlegethon is a river of fire. In Dante's Divine Comedy, it's a river of boiling blood. Either way, I don't know why they decided to name this layer after it. It's like the complete opposite. Phlegethon is a layer of deep darkness and dripping water. It's the wettest layer, despite the fact that the Styx runs through Pandesmos, and not Phlegethon. This layer differentiates itself from the others by being not just dark, but really, really dark, and also a whole lot colder. See what I mean about it being the opposite of a river of fire? Anyway, the tunnels here absorb both light and heat. Light shines only half as far, and the second edition infravision is pretty much worthless. Another difference in this layer is that gravity is normal. There's just one consistent down direction. This fact, in combination with the constantly dripping water, has given rise to enormous limestone columns, stalactites, and stalagmites. There's actually a wide variety of colors in the rock, but since it's so dark here, it can be quite hard to actually see it. Phlegethon draws more visitors than Cocytus. For one thing, because there's some really majestic sights to be found in the caves, if you can summon enough light to illuminate them, and because in addition to the natural treasures, this layer is known to be home to vast supplies of actual treasure as well. Of course, treasure seeking isn't without its dangers, as Phlegethon is home to some incredibly large and ferocious creatures, such as albino cave wolves as big as buffalo, giant crayfish, monstrous slimes, and naturally, given all the treasure, dragons, with layers so huge that they put most other dragon layers to shame. Phlegethon's got a few realms, but aside from those, there's really only one other noteworthy place to speak of, and that's the town of Windglum. It lies within one of the largest caverns on the plane, with enormous natural columns that hold up the ceiling. Unlike the rest of the plane, Windglum is actually well illuminated. The cavern is filled with hundreds of magical globes of light that were created when the town was young. Surprisingly, for a chaotic plane, Windglum appears to be somewhat ordered. The Citadel of Lords, home to the ruling family and center of government, sits at the center of town, and from there all the streets radiate outward at regular intervals, with cross streets winding between them. But that's about as ordered as the city planning gets, as the buildings seem to have been placed without any rhyme or reason. There is a law in town that no street may be blocked off or diverted, but aside from that, the city layout might as well be random, with mansions right next to decrepit hovels, temples right next to gambling dens, bathhouses right next to slaughterhouses, and buildings that straddle the streets. Typically, though, the buildings of the wealthy are surrounded by thick walls to separate themselves from their squalid neighbors. In addition to the light, Windglum has the benefit of being one of the calmer, quieter locations in the entire plane, and is easily defensible as well. The great cavern that houses the city has 5 openings, small enough to be gated and to prevent the inflow of too much wind. The ruler of Windglum is a tiefling by the name of Lord Wilfin Strabile. He's a Windglum native, but left for the Primaterial Plane at some point in the past. There, he made the mistake of singing a bawdy song about a sorceress, and found himself banished right back to Pandemonium. He returned to Windglum and led a popular revolt to gain the throne, and now he's devoted himself to making it into a city to rival Sigil in its planar significance. He's a long way off from that goal, and only a Windglummer would even consider that an achievable goal at all, but the town is nearly as diverse as Sigil. There's just fewer lawful races to be found here. But rather than labeling themselves in terms of race, they think in terms of families or houses that each are associated with a particular skill or trade. The citizens of Windglum are a suspicious and paranoid bunch. The city was founded by the Banished, and because of that, their descendants have a dim view toward all outsiders. They feel that the rest of the multiverse looks down on them, and so they return the favor. Visitors to the town are given the cold shoulder. Conversations stop when they enter an inn, they attract suspicious glares from the locals, and they're charged unreasonable prices. Because of their paranoia, Winglum also has a rather large militia, with contingents positioned at each of the gates, and 1 or 2 guards often follow visitors to town for the first couple days that they're there, to make sure they treat the locals with respect. But even though the town isn't very welcoming, it's still a common meeting ground for travelers and adventurers. That's because it's a large city, and because even with all the unfriendliness, it's still probably the friendliest place in Phlegethon. And also because Phlegethon draws adventurous types in like flies to honey due to its promise of treasure. But there is one actually friendly place in Winglum, and that's the Scaly Dog Inn. It's always been the place the locals send visitors to for lodging, but it used to have a pretty unsavory reputation, so it was more of a cruel prank to send visitors there than anything else. However, about a year ago, a gnome by the name of Haggis Grimcrack was banished to Pandemonium and found his way to Winglum. Since he's newly banished, he hasn't developed a bitterness for outsiders like the other Windglummers. He bought the Scaly Dog Inn and began repairing its reputation and expanding it by buying up the neighboring real estate. Now that the Scaly Dog Inn is actually a welcoming place, it gets more customers, and so it continues to expand. Now it occupies parts of 3 buildings that connect to each other over the street. Not only does the inn serve as a friendly safe haven against Pandemonium's constant winds, which are still an issue even in Winglum's relatively calm cavern, but it's also a sort of hiring hall for adventurers. Actually, there is one more noteworthy thing to talk about in Phlegethon that isn't a realm, and that's Caderus and the Ingress. Caderus is an old, ruined fortress deep within Phlegethon, near the Unseelie Court. It serves as a waymeet of last resort for travelers in Phlegethon, and is run by a foul-mouthed and foul-minded tiefling named Bosetti Kol Termak, who's a member of the Dispossessed. He overcharges for wretched food, disgusting beer, and uncomfortable lodging. The real reason anybody would want to come here is to find the Ingress. The Ingress are strange, hairless, small, spindly creatures with pinkish-gray skin, except for the Ingress mother, who is grotesquely bloated and fat, and often hides her kin under her enormous folds of skin. While they might not seem very impressive, they possess a very special power, which is why people seek them out. They say that the Ingress are native to Agathion, the 4th layer, and that they know that layer's secrets. The Ingress don't talk, and those who know of their existence consider them mindless, but they can seep through the stone of the 3rd layer to the 4th, and they can do the same for other people, bringing you right into whatever isolated pocket of Agathion you want, as long as you can tell them exactly what you're looking for. This is one of several instances throughout the sourcebooks that really muddies what a layer is and how they work, as seeping through the stone to get from one layer to another makes it sound like the layers occupy the same physical space. It's just a matter of how deep down you are. But as far as I can tell, in most other places throughout the books, layers are described to be, or at least implied to be, physically disconnected places, pretty much like separate dimensions, only connected to each other through magic, like portals, conduits, and barriers. So, which is it? Are layers merely geographical regions, or are they more than that? Of course, the Ingress are clearly using magical abilities to sink through stone, so perhaps it's not just travel through stone, but through the magical barrier between layers as well. And that's how I like to think of it. But since Planescape is supposed to be a mind-boggling setting, it's possible that inconsistencies in how these types of things are described are intentional, to keep the mechanics of Planescape a mystery. Or maybe that's just a convenient excuse for inconsistent writing. I'll let you be the judge. The other noteworthy locations in Phlegethon are realms. Depending on which sources you go by, there are anywhere between 1 and 5 gods that reside in this layer. There's the Queen of Air and Darkness, Erethnul, Dirinka, Zeboim, and Ibrandul. The Queen of Air and Darkness is the evil queen of the fairies, essentially the opposite of Titania, the queen of the good fairies of the Seelie Court. In fact, they're sisters, and long ago she was corrupted to utter evil by a mystical black diamond, and now she hungers to spread that corruption throughout all fairy kind. Her realm is known as the Unseelie Court, and it's pretty much the inverse in every way to the Seelie Court. Where the Seelie Court is full of laughter, friendship, and loveliness, The Unseelie Court is filled with hatred, enslavement, and death. It's located in an immense cavern of blackest stone and a ceiling of crystal, deep within Phlegethon, far from any usual routes of travel, except Kadaris. The center of the cavern is dominated by a mountainous stalagmite, atop which sits the onyx throne of the Queen of Air and Darkness. The corrupting black diamond rests on the throne, and the Queen herself no longer even manifests a physical body. Instead, her presence fills the entire cavern, emanating from a cloud of blackness flickering with continual lightning hovering above the throne. There are no towns or settlements within this realm, just a mass of beings enslaved to the will of the Queen, like a giant hive mind. There are evil fairies, undead, and all sorts of evil beasts, either going about their appointed tasks to work toward the goal of bringing the Seelie Court under the sway of the Dark Queen's corruption, or gathered mindlessly around the throne. Visiting this realm is an exceptionally bad idea. Since all minds here have been enslaved under her will, the only person you're going to encounter is her, no matter who you talk to. If she deems you useful, she'll enslave you as well and add you to her army. If not, she'll simply kill you. In later editions, the Unseelie Court is also called the Gloaming Court, and is instead located in the Feywild. Aerith Newell, as I mentioned, is the god of hate, envy, and slaughter from Greyhawk. In 2nd edition, his realm is the Fields of Malice in Cocytus. According to 3rd edition, it's the Citadel of Slaughter in Phlegethon. It's a tumbled ruin of some vast citadel, with twisting passages that channel cold winds on which can always be heard the sound of terrible battle. Battle-crazed petitioners roam the passages, desiring nothing more than to slay each other. Aerith Newell himself resides in the center of the citadel, slaughtering an endless stream of petitioners, as well as mortal captives. No one comes here on purpose, except for those who worship Aerith Newell and wish to participate in the eternal slaughter. Darinka is the Darrow god of cruelty, magic, and knowledge. Darrow are dark dwarves, similar to the Dwergar, but where the Dwergar are of a lawful evil persuasion, Darrow are chaotic evil. The story goes that Darinka and his brother Dinkarazan stole some dark and powerful magic from Ilsensine, the god of the Mind Flayers. They were caught, and in order to escape, Darinka had to betray Dinkarazan, leaving him to be imprisoned in the abyss by Ilsensine. But now Darinka uses that stolen magic to empower the Darrow. His realm, known as Hidden Betrayal, is tucked away somewhere in this layer, said to be a chillingly dark place that drips endlessly with foul water, but no one who's ever seen it has returned to speak of it. Zeboim is the Krynnish goddess of seas, storms, and jealousy. She represents the sea's uncaring and tempestuous nature. Her realm is called Maelstrom, which, with a name like that, I imagine to be a realm of chaotic swirling ocean, but there isn't really any information about it. Though this book says that it's in the abyss. Ibrandul was the Faerunian god of the Underdark and caverns. I say was because he died during the Time of Troubles, a period when all the gods of Faerun were forced to walk the earth in mortal form. He was killed by Shar, the Faerunian goddess of dark, night, and loss, for daring to take her followers. So now his godly portfolio belongs to her. His realm was called Ibrandularin. I think typically what happens when a god dies is their realm slowly withers away until there's nothing left of it. But this book says that what remains of his realm is now adrift in the astral plane. So, as you can see, there are cases to be made for all of these gods, except Darinka, that their realms aren't even in Phlegethon. But there are a few other gods that I want to mention. Not gods of this layer, just gods of Pandemonium generally, but they don't really fit in anywhere else. That would be Gorelick, Kargra, and Task. Gorelick is a god of the Gnolls, who has been steadily declining in power due to a continual erosion in his worship thanks to the usurper demon lord Yinogu. In fact, his status has declined to the point where he's more Hyenodon than Gnoll. Gorelick wanders the lower planes, so he's not strictly speaking a god of Pandemonium, but he does spend most of his time in this plane, or in the abyss. His realm consists of a 100-yard radius around his body, and any Gnoll who enters it automatically transforms into a Hyenodon to join his hunting pack, and anyone else who enters it is very likely to quickly die. Kargra is the great crab god, worshipped by the Sartani, which are basically half-human, half-crab people. His realm is said to be somewhere in Pandemonium. Task is the dragon god of greed and selfishness. His lair in Pandemonium is said to hide the largest and richest hoard of treasure in the entire multiverse, though the followers of Astilabor dispute this, as the same is said of that god's lair in Limbo. Astilabor is the dragon god of the acquisition of wealth, with no evil attached. Task, on the other hand, wants it all, and doesn't care how he gets it. So if I had to put my money on whose hoard is bigger, I'd probably bet on Task. And while the sources don't specifically say where in Pandemonium his realm is, since Phlegethon is known for dragons and treasure hoards, it would make sense that it would be here. The fourth and final layer in Pandemonium is Agathion, or perhaps you'd like to pronounce that Agathion. I actually think Agathion sounds better, but apparently Agathion is the official pronunciation, so I'm just going to go with that. And by the way, I mistakenly said in my Guide to Sigil video that Agathion is the third layer. That's because this book makes the same mistake, and I didn't catch it. It's by far the strangest, deadliest, and least hospitable layer, though luckily it's also the least accessible. In fact, it may be one of the least accessible layers in all of the Outer Planes. Instead of caverns and tunnels, it consists of isolated and disconnected bubbles within endless rock. Some of these bubbles can be accessed through magical barriers connecting them to places in the other layers. The winds that come through the barriers create cyclones capable of carrying creatures weighing hundreds of pounds. Needless to say, many people have died this way, so be careful stepping through magic barriers while exploring Pandemonium. But many of Agathion's bubbles aren't connected to a barrier. Unlike the rest of Pandemonium, these places have air that's utterly still. Some don't even have air at all. First edition specifies that of these barrierless chambers, half of them have stale air and half of them have no air. These spherical bubbles are just open spaces in the otherwise solid rock of the layer, mostly without any passages leading to them. As you then would expect, they're incredibly difficult to actually get to. For this reason, they're sometimes used as vaults where gods or other extremely powerful creatures hide things, like precious treasures, reality-warping artifacts, or horrific monsters that they don't want running loose. Or sometimes they might fill a bubble with their treasure and a horrific monster, for extra protection. One such example, not of the monster thing, but of the hidden artifact thing, was when Kia Ransely, the drow goddess of vengeance, killed Orcus, the demon lord of undeath, and took over his lair in the abyss. She sent 2 of her servants to Agathion to hide the wand of Orcus, his most powerful artifact. When they returned, she drowned them in the river Styx, so that even if they were resurrected, they wouldn't remember where they hid it, or having ever hidden it at all. But Orcus was resurrected, actually partially due to Asarak, the famous lich who has a shrine in Cocytus. However, Orcus came back without his full power. To get it back, he'd need his wand, so he concocted a plan. He scoured the mysterious and ancient ruins of Pelion, the deepest layer of Arborea, and found the last word, an extraordinarily powerful magic capable of killing gods, which might be part of the language primeval that only the most ancient entities know, including the Lady of Pain. He then went to Mechanus to seek out Primus, the god of the Modrons, as he's said to see everything in the multiverse, or more of everything than anyone else does. But Primus wouldn't tell him the location of the wand, so Orcus, going by the name Tenebris, killed him and took his place so that he could tap into Primus's infinity web, allowing him to see through the eyes of all Modrons. He then sent the Modrons on an extremely premature and chaotic Great Modron March to scour the plains in search of the wand. They didn't quite find it, but they did find the 2 resurrected servants of Kia Ransely who hid it. Luckily, in Beator, in the realm of Set, there exists a special flower that can reverse the effects of the river Styx, and so finally, Orcus learned the location of his wand, reclaimed it, and took back his abyssal lair. Another tale tells of Shekalor, who was the greatest mage in Sigil some 10,000 years ago. His thirst for power was so great that he wanted to replace the Lady of Pain as the ruler of the City of Doors. He searched ancient arcane texts for some secret weakness that she might have, and eventually found a scroll claiming that an even more ancient wizard had nearly succeeded in bringing her down. But the Lady of Pain bested him, and bound his soul inside an orb that she sealed away in a hidden vault in Agathion. So Shekalor went to this lair in search of this orb, and that search took him 50 years. One day, he unexpectedly returned to Sigil, stumbling out of a portal in the city court, looking ragged and crazed, his internal organs glowing through his skin, holding fistfuls of gems and screaming about spiders, before bursting into flames and dying. That's about what you can expect from seeking artifacts in Agathion. Because Agathion is so inhospitable and inaccessible, it's very rarely visited, even by Pandemonium standards. But it's safe to say that most people who do visit it die horrible deaths, or are themselves the very powerful creatures making vaults here. There are no known towns in this layer, no strongholds, and while the gods may stash things here, none of them reside here, so there are no realms. In 4th edition, Pandemonium is said to harbor a small number of Tharizdun's ancient servants in the darkest depths, monstrous guardians and angels of madness. I imagine that this is where they'd be, if 4th edition's version of Pandemonium had layers, that is. Vecna is also said to maintain a hidden tower in the heart of Pandemonium in 4th edition. Given that he's up to nefarious deeds in Pandesmos in Vecna Eve of Ruin, that tower might be there, but I could very well see it being in Agathion instead. Overall, Agathion is a mysterious layer with hardly any actual information about it, and there's pros and cons to that. On the one hand, since it's so mysterious, there's really no way for players to have information about what they can expect from it. So any adventure here is bound to be charged with an aura of excitement. Though I suppose they would have to know enough about the Outer Planes and Agathion to know its reputation in order for that excitement to be there. They have to be aware of that absence of knowledge. But on the other hand, it makes the DM do all the hard work of coming up with what's actually here. Presumably, a lot of the point of using pre-written material is that it lightens the workload for the DM, but the scant details can be enough to spark inspiration.
And that's the complete guide to Pandemonium. I'm a big fan of this plane, as I love a classic dungeon crawl, and this plane is practically one giant dungeon.
Plus, the insanity element is really fun and provides a lot of role-playing opportunities for both the players and the DM, as every NPC that lives here has some insane behavior. My only disappointment with Pandemonium is that it doesn't provide much of interest philosophically compared to many of the other planes. At least, that's what I found. If you've enjoyed this video, consider subscribing to my channel or checking out some of my other videos. And if you've enjoyed a few of my videos, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter. My supporters get access to update posts, ad-free videos, scripts, audio-only videos weeks before the full video, and they get their names at the end of my videos, as well as the ability to vote on future videos. But whether you're a subscriber, a Patreon supporter, or neither, thank you for watching.